Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the gritty world of the Middle Ages. Not for tales of knights or kings, but for something much more raw and unsettling. Medieval times weren't just about castles and chivalry. They were a brutal test of survival that most of us wouldn't last a single day in. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely vibe with these deep dives, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's wild to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and get ready for a journey into the harsh realities that made medieval life a daily fight for existence. Streets were filled with human waste. Thrown from windows, imagine walking through the heart of medieval York or Paris, not as a distant observer, but as a resident whose daily life depends on careful steps and a keen ear. The narrow, winding streets aren't charming. They're traps lined with sticky refuse, reeking so powerfully that it seeps through the thickest cloth. But this isn't an isolated story. This is how entire civilizations lived for centuries, breathing in the consequences of urban life before sanitation, before the concept of public health even existed. Step outside your wooden door at dawn. The chill is sharp, but the smell is sharper. Above you, windows swing open, no glass, just wooden shutters. A warning call rings out in dialect, sometimes just a quick word, garde l'eau, or mind the water. But often, there's no warning at all. Then it happens, the sudden splash, a heavy, noxious rain of waste tumbling from the upper stories, crashing onto the cobblestones, sometimes missing your shoulder by mere inches. Chamber pots, filled overnight with every imaginable human excretion, are simply emptied out of the nearest window. It's easy to laugh at the thought, but this was the daily lived reality for people across medieval Europe. Imagine the danger, the humiliation, the knowledge that at any moment you could be struck by filth. You couldn't escape it. There was no true, clean air. Every breath carried the invisible threat of disease. Why was it like this? In these cities, most homes were tall, narrow, and pressed tightly together. Indoor plumbing was centuries away. Few had private latrines. For the wealthy, there might be a privy built into the thick stone walls, a vertical shaft dropping to a cesspit, which servants would occasionally, grudgingly empty. But for everyone else? The chamber pot was a universal democratic horror. Night after night, families filled their pots. By dawn, the waste had to go somewhere. Streets, already crowded with vendors, animals, and people, became the default dumping ground. Imagine layers upon layers of excrement, horse manure, kitchen scraps, dead rodents, and more, all fermenting in the gutters. During rain, the refuse mixed into a foul river. During drought, the sun baked it into a crust, which wind would then turn to choking dust. You could try to skirt the main thoroughfares, but the network of alleys and passageways, dark and poorly ventilated, were even worse. Waste pooled in hidden corners, thick with flies, rats, and the ever-present risk of stepping ankle-deep into rot. The problem wasn't ignorance. People knew the streets were deadly. In Paris, officials periodically issued decrees demanding citizens clean the front of their homes. In York and London, city authorities hired rakers, men with broad shovels whose job was to scrape muck from the gutters. But it was an impossible task. Every morning brought new filth. And what about the health consequences? The stench wasn't just disgusting, it was lethal. Medieval medicine believed that bad air, or miasma, caused illness. They weren't entirely wrong. The unrelenting presence of decomposing matter led to waves of infectious diseases: dysentery, cholera, typhus, the plague itself. Infants died in droves. Life expectancy plummeted. The city became a living organism, devouring its own inhabitants. There's a common myth that medieval people were simply dirty or unconcerned with hygiene. But reality was more complicated and darker. In many places, laws attempted to regulate waste, but the physical infrastructure simply didn't exist. There were no underground sewers, no running water. Even the mighty cathedrals, symbols of spiritual purity, often stood next to overflowing cesspits. Water drawn from public wells could be contaminated by seepage from nearby waste. turning the basic act of drinking into a daily gamble with death. Sometimes authorities tried to innovate. In 14th century Paris, the construction of the first rudimentary sewers was celebrated as a marvel, but the system was crude and constantly overwhelmed. In London, the river fleet became an open sewer, carrying refuse from the city to the Thames, which itself was a dump for every kind of waste. Fishermen pulled their nets through sludge. Children played by banks slick with human and animal remains. Personal stories haunt these streets. Imagine the mother clutching her child, warning them to keep to the center of the lane, to avoid the dripping edges where chamber pots were most likely to strike. Imagine the apprentice running errands for his master, dashing from awning to awning, cloak pulled tightly around his face. Imagine the sick, the elderly, the outcast, forced to live at the lowest points of the city where the refuse gathered deepest. Yet life went on. Markets thrived in the shadow of filth. Lovers met beneath windows that might open at any moment. Processions and festivals wound their way through muck and mire, bright banners fluttering above, feet squelching below. People adapted because adaptation was the only option. The consequences rippled outwards. Disease didn't just kill, it shaped the city's very fabric. Walls were built not only to defend against invaders, but to contain outbreaks. Quarantine zones marked by red crosses signaled where plague had struck, often in the dirtiest quarters. The city's smell was its warning sign, and yet also its call to resilience. Modern viewers might recoil, but the story of human waste in the streets is not simply about disgust. It's about survival, about how people, lacking technology but desperate for community and connection, endured the unendurable, about how the city's body, riddled with waste, was still a place of invention, creativity, and daily courage. Change came slowly. The arrival of closed sewers in the 18th and 19th centuries revolutionized urban life. But until then, generations lived and died amid this constant assault on their senses and health. The memory lingers in language, streets called Muck Lane, Foulgate, Dung Hill. The layers of the past are still there, beneath the cobblestones, beneath our feet, a reminder that civilization is always just one step away from chaos. To truly understand the history of these cities, you must smell the air, hear the warning cries, feel the cold splash of a stranger's waste. You must walk the streets as they were, not as you wish them to be, alive with noise, filth, and the undaunted will to keep moving forward. The story of human waste in medieval streets is the story of human endurance, of what we choose to ignore, of the slow, agonizing birth of modern civilization, one overflowing chamber pot at a time. Open meat markets, swarmed with flies and rotting flesh. Imagine you're walking through a medieval city just after sunrise. The sun cuts through a low, greasy haze that hangs above the narrow, twisting streets. The air is thick with the weight of summer, heat pressing into every crevice, saturating stone, wood, and flesh alike. You turn a corner, and suddenly you're hit by a smell so overwhelming it feels physical. An invisible wall that knocks the breath out of your chest. This is the scent of death and decay, the unmistakable stench of rotting meat. You have entered the open meat market, the ancient heart of every European town, where the true cost of hunger plays out in real time. It's here, not in the clean silence of modern supermarkets, that the story of food, survival, and risk takes on its darkest shade. Rows of wooden stalls stretch out in a crude, chaotic maze. There's no glass, no ice, and certainly no refrigeration. Instead, you see heavy slabs of beef, veal, and mutton hung from rusted hooks. Fat and gristle drip steadily onto the cobblestones, pooling into sticky red-black puddles at your feet. The butcher's hands are bare and filthy, caked with blood from a dozen animals already killed that morning. The noise is constant. The clatter of knives on bone, shouts of haggling, and the relentless buzzing cloud of flies that covers every exposed surface. Every cut of meat, no matter how fresh at dawn, is already beginning to turn by noon, and by evening, the entire market is transformed into a breeding ground for maggots. For most people in the medieval world, this is normal. Meat was expensive, sometimes rare, but when it was available, it almost always came with a gamble. There was no way to preserve flesh for long, not in summer, not without salt or smoke, and those methods were reserved for the wealthy or for feast days. The average buyer faces a terrible choice. Take your chance with the butcher's latest offering or go hungry. As the sun climbs higher and the heat grows, the spoilage accelerates. Flies lay their eggs deep in the fatty tissue, maggots wriggle beneath the surface, and every purchase could be a death sentence waiting to hatch. The markets were more than just a place to buy food, they were theaters of survival. Butchers tried to hide the worst cuts under a layer of fresher meat, turning slabs over so the least decayed side faced customers. Sometimes they washed meat in wine or vinegar to mask the smell and slow the rot. Spices and strong sauces were not only for taste but for self-defense, a desperate effort to make rotten flesh seem edible. The church and local authorities issued edicts and fines against the worst offenders, but enforcement was sporadic at best. Corruption was rampant, and more often than not, the poor were left with whatever was left at the end of the day, scraps, sinew, and offal crawling with life. But this was not just the story of individual butchers and desperate customers. The dangers of spoiled meat rippled through medieval society, feeding a shadow epidemic that most people never fully understood. Fatal food poisoning was a silent killer. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. The only clues were the sudden fever, the cramps, the violent sickness that claimed the old, the weak, and sometimes even the young and strong within hours. Whole families could vanish in a matter of days, the cause attributed to curses, bad air, or simply the will of God. No one realized that the real killer was festering quietly on the butcher's block, thriving in the summer heat and the darkness beneath the surface. Medieval chronicles are filled with vague references to pestilence and putrid fevers that swept through towns and villages. Behind these words was a world where the boundary between food and poison was razor thin. The poorest families, those living closest to the market's edge, suffered the most. They bought what others refused or scavenged what was thrown out at dusk. Children picked through bones for scraps of gristle. Elderly women boiled down rancid fat for tallow candles or for a thin, greasy broth. For many, there was no other option. Hunger itself was always waiting, a second, slower death shadowing every meal. The marketplace was also a breeding ground for rumors and superstitions. When outbreaks of sickness swept through a town, suspicions turned to the butchers first. Some were accused of witchcraft or of knowingly selling cursed meat. Others tried to appease angry crowds by performing public slaughterings or burning spoiled flesh in great smoky pyres. But the cycle continued. As long as people needed to eat, the market remained unclean, dangerous, yet utterly essential. You might wonder, did anyone try to fight back against this tide of filth and disease? The answer is both yes and no. In some cities, guilds of butchers enforced their own rules, insisting on morning slaughter and immediate sale, banning the keeping of meat overnight. Inspectors were appointed, but their power depended on the season, the local lord, or even their own hunger. In London and Paris, meat markets were eventually forced to move outside city walls, where the wind could carry away some of the stench and disease. Still, for centuries, the problem never fully went away. On hot days, even the grandest squares could become a labyrinth of rot and risk. Behind every meal in the medieval world was an invisible calculation, a weighing of risk and necessity. The taste of meat, rare and precious, was always tinged with fear. Cooks learned to boil, stew, and spice, not only to improve flavor, but to hide danger. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, imported at great cost from Asia, became prized not just for their exotic allure, but for their power to mask the telltale scent of decay. In a way, the global spice trade owes its very existence to this daily battle with rot, turning the hunger for survival into a driving force of world history. The consequences of these markets extended far beyond the walls of a single city. They shaped the way people ate, the recipes they wrote down, and the stories they told about food and fate. Even today, the legacy of those centuries lingers. Modern food safety laws, refrigeration, and the very idea of an expiration date are all descendants of that ancient, ceaseless struggle to eat without dying. The next time you walk through a clean, refrigerated aisle or unwrap a fresh steak from its sterile package, you're living in the shadow of those medieval markets, their dangers forgotten but never truly erased. Yet, for millions who lived and died in those centuries, there was no forgetting. Every trip to the market was a negotiation with risk, a gamble with fate. Mothers learned to trust their noses, to fear the silvery shine of maggots beneath the fat, to know that sometimes hunger itself was safer than the feast. Even the animals seemed to sense the danger. Dogs and cats prowled the stalls, feasting on scraps, growing wild and cunning from the taste of human waste and corruption. Rats multiplied, thriving in the gutters beneath the butcher's feet, carrying yet more disease from stall to stall, home to home. In this world, even survival was tainted. When the summer heat turned the market into a cauldron of decay, you could feel the fear in the air, hidden behind the bravado of the sellers, the desperation of the buyers, the quiet prayers of the hungry. Every meal was a risk, every bite a possible end. The medieval meat market was not just a place of commerce, but a battlefield in the war against death, a war fought with knives, spices, and desperate hope in the endless sunlit shadows of history. And so, as you step away from the imagined stench and noise, remember what it cost to eat in the centuries before science, before refrigeration, before safety. Remember the invisible war waged beneath the surface of every meal. Because history is not only in the grand cathedrals or the crowns of kings, it is here, in the swarm of flies, in the flesh that turns, in the hunger that never quite disappears, and in the silent, deadly gamble that was once the price of simply staying alive. Rats and fleas were everywhere and carried the Black Death. In the year 1348, a creeping horror began to seep into the bustling heart of medieval Europe. It started with whispers. Rumors of a strange sickness in distant lands carried westward along the arteries of trade and conquest. But those rumors soon became reality, bleeding into the cities and villages with an invisible force. The people who lived then did not understand the science of disease. They did not know about bacteria or plague. What they saw, what they lived, was a nightmare that began with something far more ordinary: rats. Every medieval town was alive with the sound and movement of these creatures. Rats scurried along gutters, slipped beneath market stalls, nested in the straw of stables, and gnawed through sacks of grain stored in shadowy corners. In the chaos of city life, where garbage piled high in alleys and food scraps littered the ground, rats thrived. But it was not the rats themselves that would change the course of history. It was what clung to their backs. Tiny, hungry fleas, too small to see, but deadly enough to erase entire families from existence. The flea, Xenopsila chiopus, had no loyalty to rat or man. It hopped from host to host, searching for blood, and carried with it a hitchhiker far more dangerous, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria multiplied until the flea itself grew ravenous, its feeding blocked by a thick mass of plague. Desperate, it bit more furiously, vomiting the infection directly into the bloodstreams of its victims. In 1348, ships docked in European ports, their holds filled with spices, silk, and grain, and with dying sailors, feverish and covered in mysterious swellings. The rats, always eager for a new opportunity, disembarked alongside the cargo. From port towns like Genoa and Marseille, the disease fanned outward along trade routes, following the movement of goods, money, and people. No wall, no moat, no locked door could keep it out. The plague seeped beneath thresholds and crept up wooden stairs. It found its way into the homes of the rich and poor alike. Within days of infection, the signs were unmistakable. First came a high fever and chills, as if a burning fire had been lit inside the body. Then the swelling. Agonizing blackened lumps called buboes erupting in the groin, armpits, or neck. These lumps were lymph nodes, swollen to the size of eggs, tender to the touch, and often leaking pus and blood. The pain was unbearable, a sickness that could not be soothed by any remedy known to the medieval apothecary. Some tried herbs or incense, others turned to prayer, believing the pestilence to be God's punishment. Many simply fled, abandoning sick relatives and neighbors to their fate. But the plague moved faster than fear. Within hours, a healthy person could fall ill. Within days, they could be dead. There was no logic, no pattern that people could recognize, except that rats and fleas were everywhere, and death followed them. In the cramped, filthy towns of medieval Europe, the dead began to outnumber the living. Corpses piled up in alleyways and doorways, sometimes stacked 3 or 4 high, awaiting burial. Church bells tolled constantly, marking another lost soul, another family wiped out. The air was thick with the stench of decay and rot, a miasma so powerful that it seemed to cling to the skin and clothes of every survivor. Children wandered the streets alone, their parents gone. Priests and monks died in droves as they ministered to the sick, carrying the disease from one bed to another. Gravediggers could not keep up. In some towns, pits were dug in haste, mass graves into which bodies were thrown, unnamed and unblessed. The rats came to feast upon the corpses, their numbers undiminished, their fleas still seeking warm blood. The city of Florence, once vibrant and filled with merchants and artists, lost more than half its people in a single year. In London, the narrow lanes were clogged with funeral processions. In Paris, doctors in long-beaked masks, stuffed with herbs, patrolled the streets, but their presence was little comfort. No one could explain why some survived and others perished, why entire households died within days, their pets and livestock falling sick alongside them. As the plague spread, fear turned to suspicion. Foreigners, beggars, even lepers were blamed, beaten, or driven out. But no scapegoat could stop the advance of the rats and their invisible armies. The disease moved with the speed of rumor, carried in the blood of travelers, the clothing of merchants, and the fur of animals. Some towns tried to quarantine the sick, but the measures were too late. By the time the first symptoms appeared, the infection had already been passed along to dozens more. Personal stories from chroniclers of the age read like a record of apocalypse. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of Florence, "Brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, wife her husband, and one's own children were seldom visited or tended." People locked themselves in their homes, hoping to escape the pestilence, but often only sealed their fate as the rats chewed through the walls, bringing fleas and death inside. Doors marked with painted crosses signaled plague within. In the morning, the silence behind those doors was a warning. Medieval medicine was helpless. Doctors prescribed bloodletting, potions of mercury or vinegar, or the burning of aromatic woods, all useless against an enemy they could not see. Superstition filled the void. Some wore charms or talismans, believing a scrap of holy text could turn aside the sickness. Others joined in flagellant processions, whipping themselves through the streets in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. None of it worked. The rats kept coming, as if summoned by the very chaos. The social order began to collapse. Markets were deserted, law and order crumbled, and the intricate web of medieval society, built on guilds, families, and faith, unraveled. Towns emptied as people fled to the countryside, but the disease followed, carried by the animals they brought with them. Sometimes a single rat could doom an entire village. No one was safe. Over the course of just a few years, the Black Death killed as many as 1 in every 3 people in Europe, perhaps more than 25 million souls. The survivors were changed forever. Fields lay fallow, villages were abandoned, and the old certainties of life and faith were broken. The memory of the plague haunted art, literature, and legend for centuries. Even when the worst had passed, outbreaks would return, reminders that the rats and fleas had not vanished, that beneath the surface of daily life, the seeds of disaster could be waiting. The true horror of the Black Death was not just in the numbers or the speed, but in its intimacy, the way it moved from rat to flea to human, from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to child. In a world where science could not save, where every scratching sound in the walls could be a death sentence, the line between life and death blurred. Each household lived with the knowledge that tomorrow their door could be marked, their family left to die in silence with only the skittering of rats and the bite of unseen fleas as witness. In the end, the story of the Black Death is not just a tale of rats and fleas, but of human vulnerability, resilience, and the mysteries of survival. It is a chapter written in fear and suffering, but also in endurance, the survivors who rebuilt, the memories that endured, and the shadow that still lingers over crowded cities and quiet villages in every scurrying rat and every fleeting itch. The plague changed Europe forever, but its echoes remain, a reminder that even the smallest creatures can carry the weight of history, and that every shadow, every sound in the dark, can hold the seeds of something that once brought the world to its knees. Water came from filthy wells, shared with dying animals. Imagine waking up in a medieval town, a place where every new day arrives thick with the stink of tanneries, the noise of carts, and the invisible but ever-present weight of disease. You're thirsty. You want a drink of water, and for a moment you think nothing could be simpler. But in this world, water isn't life. It's a gamble with death. Picture the village well at dawn. There's already a queue. Tired women, gaunt children, a few stooped elders, and a cluster of animals, some coughing, others foaming at the mouth, all gathered around the same stony opening in the earth. The well is the heart of the town, but it's also a silent grave for dozens who never lived to see another sunrise. Because in this time, clean water is a fantasy, and the truth is almost no one here has ever tasted it. The same rope and bucket that draws up your next drink was just lowered to wash a bloody hide or to soak a dead dog found in the street. Perhaps last night someone threw in a carcass to hide the smell of rot from their own doorstep. Maybe the tanner, whose livelihood depends on the chemical reek of decomposing animal skin, rinsed his filthy tools in the only source of water the whole town shares. That same water trickles down to the lips of every child, the hands of every cook, the mouth of every feverish old man. There is no distinction between what the living use to sustain themselves and what the dying leave behind as a warning. Why was this accepted? For most people, there was no other option. Wells and streams were communal, and property lines rarely included their own private spring. Only the rich, the very highest of society, might afford their own drawn supply, sometimes protected by high walls and a hired guard, often envied and sometimes even poisoned by rivals. The rest made do with what they had, and what they had was a constant dance with contamination. And in the dark centuries of plague and war, a deadly dance with disease. It's hard to imagine the horror of what would happen after a festival, or after the markets closed and scraps were thrown into the street. Offal, blood, and discarded animal parts, sometimes even the bodies of dogs, rats, or the poor who had no family, would be dragged or swept into nearby rivers or streams. These same rivers downstream would become the next village's drinking supply. Even the word well is misleading, because in many towns the well was only as deep as the nearest cesspit. Human and animal waste filtered slowly down through the loose soil, pooling in underground streams, mixing with rain, leaking into the bucket that would fill a hungry child's stomach or boil the next day's bread. Medieval towns weren't blind to the dangers. Chroniclers wrote of outbreaks of bloody flux, what we now know as dysentery, that swept through neighborhoods, felling the young, the strong, and the old alike. Priests might call for processions and prayers. Physicians, relying on ancient texts and dubious remedies, might prescribe herbs or strange rituals. But no one could see the real cause, microscopic killers invisible in an age before even the faintest idea of germs. The best advice was to boil your water, but in places where fuel was scarce and fires precious, few bothered. And what was the point when the flavor and stink of corruption was impossible to boil away? The bodies piled up. During bad years like the Great Plagues of the 14th century, entire families might die within days, first struck by a sudden fever, then by relentless, bloody diarrhea, vomiting, and delirium. Some would be buried hastily in shallow graves or tossed into the rivers that meandered through the city, further poisoning the water supply for the next unlucky village. Travelers' diaries from this era describe water that ran thick with animal fat and the oily sheen of decomposing flesh. Sometimes desperate peasants drank anyway, unable to resist the basic urge for water as the heat of summer bore down and the wells grew cloudy and warm. This wasn't limited to tiny villages. Great cities, Paris, London, Florence, were built along rivers not just for commerce, but for the promise of water. Yet the same river that brought trade and wealth also brought disease and death. In London, the Thames was so choked with refuse that its banks steamed with decay in the afternoon sun. Children fished floating rats from the mud, and scavengers dredged up the swollen bodies of the drowned or diseased, sometimes stripping them for valuables before tossing them back in. It's a myth that everyone drank beer or wine. The poor couldn't afford to, and even the beer itself was often brewed with contaminated water. There were warning signs, but they were misunderstood. People noticed that certain wells made whole neighborhoods sick, or that those who lived nearest the river often died first. Medieval law codes sometimes banned dumping waste into rivers or wells, but enforcement was weak or impossible. During times of famine or war, any sense of public hygiene disappeared, replaced by raw survival. Thieves and beggars sometimes poisoned wells intentionally, hoping to create chaos or exact revenge. Others, less malicious but just as dangerous, washed off blood or filth in the nearest water source because they simply didn't know better or had no other choice. Animals, too, played their part in this deadly cycle. Horses, cows, goats, and pigs drank from the same sources as people. When drought struck, the competition for water became desperate and violent. Sick animals staggered to the wells, collapsed, and died. Sometimes their carcasses would be left to rot where they fell, bloating and leaching infection into the water below. Farmers, desperate to save their livestock, would water them in the communal wells, polluting it for everyone else. Dogs and rats, vectors of even more terrifying diseases, gnawed the remains and spread filth from street to street. The result was an endless churn of death and misery, punctuated by brief respites when winter's cold froze the filth or heavy rains washed it away, only to deposit it elsewhere. In the records of old towns, you'll find countless references to mysterious plagues, fevers, fluxes, and ague, the catch-all words for a spectrum of waterborne horrors. Medieval people believed in miasma, the theory that bad air caused disease, and in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. The stench of rot was often the scent of death in the making. But the air was just a messenger. The real killer flowed silently through every cup, bowl, and mouthful. And still, life went on. Children played near the wells, sometimes falling in and drowning, their bodies retrieved days later when the water began to taste strange. Midwives washed newborns in the same basins used to clean butchered pigs. Bakers kneaded bread with water drawn from slime-covered barrels. Monks wrote about the virtue of fasting from wine, never realizing that their pure water was riddled with invisible death. The cycle of contamination was so complete, so inescapable, that most people accepted constant illness as a fact of life, a punishment from God, a twist of fate, or just the way things were. Only rarely did a community rebel. Some towns, racked by repeated outbreaks, pooled their meager resources to dig new wells farther from the graveyards, the tanneries, or the main streets. Others tried to establish water wardens to monitor the sources, but the power of custom, poverty, and ignorance usually overwhelmed any attempt at reform. The technology to filter or purify water simply didn't exist, and the idea that unseen life could travel in water, could kill silently and without warning, was centuries away from discovery. The history of medieval water is a history of tragic ignorance and harsh necessity. It's a story where every drink is a risk, every well a roll of the dice, and every drought a warning that the worst is yet to come. And yet, out of this hardship, people survived. They adapted, developed rituals to bless the wells, superstitions to ward off illness, and even occasional strokes of luck when a clean spring was found. But for most, water remained a daily threat, an invisible enemy more terrifying than any army, plague, or famine. The next time you pour yourself a glass, remember the centuries of suffering, the unmarked graves, and the millions lost to water that was never truly safe. This is the reality beneath the surface of every medieval town, a world where water, the essence of life, carried death in every drop, and where survival was never guaranteed, even by the most basic act of quenching your thirst. You could be falsely accused and publicly tortured without trial. In the world of medieval justice, fear did not wait for the night to fall. It stalked the open daylight wearing the face of the neighbor who glared, the bailiff who barged in, the town crier whose bell signaled yet another soul dragged through the mud. There was a time, not so distant in the long arc of human memory, when justice did not mean evidence or defense or even truth. In places like Cologne in the late 1300s, all it took to become guilty was the misfortune of standing in the wrong place, the wrong time, or the wrong eyes falling upon you. The story of the boy from 1384 is not some rare anomaly, but a brutal window into a world where accusation itself became a weapon and innocence offered no shield. Let's set the scene. Cologne, a bustling medieval city teeming with merchants, laborers, children darting through narrow streets, market stalls packed with the scents of spices, smoke, sweat. It is a place of rules, written and unwritten, governed by the pulse of power and suspicion. In 1384, the city's so-called justice system was both a spectacle and a warning, wielded not only to punish, but to perform control for the public eye. When rumors of theft broke out, a merchant missing goods, a townswoman's purse gone, suspects were found not by careful investigation, but often by convenience, by prejudice, or by unlucky circumstance. That year, a boy, his name lost to history, became the focus of such suspicion. Perhaps he was poor, perhaps simply alone, perhaps his face looked familiar to someone whose coin pouch had vanished. Perhaps he was simply in the wrong alley at dusk, his hands empty, but his fate already sealed. It did not matter. The machinery of town justice had already begun to turn. In medieval Cologne, like in so many European cities, an accusation was sometimes enough to bring a mob. There was no presumption of innocence. The accused were seized, often with violence, by local bailiffs or even by citizens themselves. Once accused, the process moved with terrifying speed. No family council, no appeals, no lawyers. The boy was dragged through the winding streets, his protests drowned by the jeers of a crowd hungry for drama, for a story, for a scapegoat. Fear and power surged together. Justice here was not about truth, but about example. Public torture was not a dark secret. It was deliberate, open, staged. The townspeople gathered to watch as the accused were whipped, branded, humiliated. There was a sick logic. If you suffered in public, it would deter others. If you bled, maybe your shame would heal the city's wounds. It was a ritual, and the crowd played their part. For the boy, this meant being stripped, bound, and beaten, his skin torn open before the very people he had grown up among. Then came the branding, iron pressed to flesh, a permanent mark of supposed guilt carried for life. This was not rare. Torture was written into law codes as a tool for extracting confessions, which were themselves considered the gold standard of guilt. The pain was meant to break you, to force an admission, even if you had nothing to confess. There was no scientific investigation, no forensic scrutiny, only the crushing logic of, if you're innocent, why do you cry? Or, only the guilty scream this loud. For children, the cruelty was even more profound. Medieval society viewed childhood differently, sometimes as a protected stage, but more often as a brief, fragile condition easily forfeited by bad luck or bad company. Boys and girls were accused, punished, even executed, often for crimes as minor as petty theft or being a nuisance to the wrong person. But what happened next in this story is the knife twist. the truth emerged. Evidence, belated, insufficient, yet undeniable, proved the boy's innocence. The goods he had supposedly stolen were found elsewhere. Someone remembered seeing him elsewhere. Maybe the true culprit confessed, or maybe another witness, moved by guilt, finally spoke up. By then, the boy's life had been irrevocably altered. His back bore scars that would never heal. His face and arms bore the burn of the brand, a lifelong advertisement of a crime he did not commit. In a world where reputation meant everything, the stain was never fully removed. Employers, neighbors, even future family would always know, always doubt, always suspect. Innocence in the eyes of the law could not undo the violence of the punishment. Why did such injustice persist for centuries? The answer lies in the fragile foundations of medieval order. Cities were anxious about thieves, about vagrants, about rebellion and disease and famine. The ruling classes, desperate to assert control, made brutal examples of the unlucky. Town authorities had little incentive to admit error, for to do so would be to reveal the weakness of their grip. Public punishments reassured the fearful that someone at least was being held accountable. But the deeper cruelty was that justice, as enacted, was more about preserving authority than seeking truth. The psychological toll on the falsely accused was immense. The medieval world was closely knit, where anonymity was impossible. Everyone's history was public property, whispered through alleys, traded in markets, held up as cautionary tales. For a child especially, the trauma was not just physical, but social, ostracism, suspicion, even exile. Some never recovered. Others, marked as criminals, found only doors closed, futures darkened. This was not unique to Cologne. Across Europe, records tell of similar tragedies: boys and girls executed for crimes later disproved, adults who lost everything on the word of an enemy, strangers whipped or burned for witchcraft, heresy, or theft. And, at every turn, the crowd watched. Public spectacle was both a punishment and a performance. To the authorities, it was a lesson. To the victim, it was a curse that never faded. There were, on rare occasions, those who spoke out, clerics, scholars, sometimes even nobles, questioning the wisdom of such brutality. But their voices were usually lost beneath the thunder of tradition and fear. The machinery rolled on. Reforms, when they came, were centuries in the making, incremental, always contested. The idea of innocent until proven guilty would not take root until much later. For those caught in the grinding gears of medieval justice, that was little comfort. As we reflect on this one boy's fate, we see the darker truth. In a society built on suspicion and power, no one was truly safe. Today, we take for granted the right to a fair trial, to evidence, to defense, to dignity, in the face of accusation. But the scars of history remind us that justice is always fragile, always at risk of collapsing into spectacle, fear, and violence. The echoes of those public tortures haunt us, not as distant curiosities, but as warnings, reminders that without vigilance, the machinery of accusation can grind innocence into oblivion. The boy from Cologne was innocent, but in his world that did not matter. Only the crowd's hunger and the iron's brand remained, and the world moved on, pretending justice had been served. Fire could wipe out the entire town in hours. Picture a city built for disaster. Wooden houses, thatched roofs, tar and pitch, sealing the cracks. It is the early 13th century, and London, already one of the greatest cities in Europe, crouches on the banks of the Thames, restless and combustible. The streets are so narrow that 2 wagons can barely pass. The buildings lean into each other, windows almost touching, creating a canyon of dry timber and straw above a labyrinth of stalls, workshops, animal pens, and crowded homes below. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the city breathing, thousands of hearths, kitchens, and candles flickering at every hour. Now open your eyes to a night in July 1212. The air is warm and dry. The city is alive, restless, as people sleep behind thin wooden walls. A single spark, maybe a candle, maybe a cooking fire left unwatched, maybe lightning, or something as simple as the carelessness of a tired hand, jumps into kindling. Flames climb the walls, licking at the timber beams, greedily searching for something more. In minutes, one house is alight. In an hour, the whole district. There are no sirens, no alarms, no brave firefighters racing to the rescue, no citywide plan for disaster. There is only panic, the primal, contagious panic that grips a crowd when the air itself starts to burn. You hear screams before you see the fire, a high rising wail rolling through the lanes as families rush into the night with whatever they can grab. Some pour water from wells, desperate and futile. Some beat at the flames with blankets. But the city is built to burn. The wind off the river funnels down the cramped alleys, carrying embers from one rooftop to the next, showering sparks over barns and sheds packed with dry hay. London's 1212 fire, remembered as one of the most devastating in medieval Europe, devours everything in its path. The Southwark district ignites first, flames leaping across the timber bridge that connects the city to the south bank of the Thames. Onlookers gather, horrified, on London Bridge itself, believing perhaps that the stone structure will hold. But the bridge is lined with houses and shops, built right onto its surface, their walls and floors packed with wood, cloth, and flammable oils. The flames find these too, racing across the length of the bridge, trapping hundreds of people between two infernos. It is hard to comprehend in our age of sprinklers and steel just how vulnerable these cities were. The fire is not a single event, but a chain reaction. Every home a fuse, every breeze an accelerant. In 1212, more than 3,000 homes are lost. The numbers are staggering, not just in terms of property, but in human lives. Chronicles speak of families burned alive, of people who leaped into the river and drowned rather than face the heat. On London Bridge, the tragedy compounds. Crowds fleeing from the flames at either end are trapped in the middle, the stone arches collapsing, the wood above them roaring. Some jump, weighted down by clothing and valuables, others suffocate in the crush of panicked bodies. Why was the city so helpless? It is tempting to imagine medieval people as careless, but the reality is more brutal. They simply lacked the tools to fight back. No organized fire services, no water mains, no hydrants. Buckets of water passed hand to hand barely make a dent. Sometimes the only solution is to tear down entire rows of houses ahead of the flames, if you have the time and if you can convince your neighbors to sacrifice their homes for the greater good. More often you just run and pray the wind shifts. Fire was the great equalizer. Rich and poor alike suffered. In a world of wooden cities, even kings could not guarantee their own safety. The only real protection was luck or divine intervention. After the smoke cleared, survivors wandered through fields of ash and twisted beams, searching for anything left. The city's boundaries were redrawn overnight, not by design, but by catastrophe. The 1212 fire was not the first, nor the last to devastate London. It was part of a grim pattern that shaped every medieval town. In Paris, in York, in countless cities across Europe, fire haunted the edges of daily life. Markets teemed with open flames, bakers, blacksmiths, candlemakers, all worked with fire. One mistake, one gust of wind, and the entire city could be erased before dawn. People slept lightly, always listening for the crackle, always sniffing for smoke. Children were taught not just to fear fire, but to expect it. In the aftermath of these disasters, cities tried to adapt. Laws were passed, no thatched roofs within city limits, no baking after dark, no storing of flammable goods near homes. Watchmen were appointed to patrol for fire. But the fundamental problem remained. The cities themselves were built as tinderboxes, packed so tight that even the most vigilant citizen could not prevent disaster. Rebuilding began almost immediately, but out of necessity, not innovation. Timber was cheap, stone was rare, and so the cycle of destruction and rebuilding continued for centuries. Yet in the ashes, something else grew, a stubborn kind of resilience. Families took each other in. Guilds and churches raised funds for the homeless. The city's rhythm resumed, shaped by the memory of catastrophe, but never wholly defeated by it. People rebuilt not just their homes, but their hope. And so, when you walk the old streets of London, or any ancient city, remember what lies beneath your feet. Every block, every corner is layered with the history of fire, of lives disrupted, of losses endured, of a kind of collective memory built on survival. The story of the 12-12 fire is not just about destruction, but about the enduring will of people to start again, to face uncertainty with courage, to see in every dawn not just the threat of disaster, but the promise of another chance. The city endures. The lesson lingers. Fire, in the end, shapes not just the map of a place, but the hearts of those who call it home. The air smelled of rotting flesh, tallow smoke, and sewage. Close your eyes and imagine the first breath you take as you enter a medieval city. Rouen, Bruges, Paris, York, any city where thousands of people and animals crowd together behind ancient stone walls. The air hits you like a blow. It's thick, humid, oppressive. At first, you might think it's just the unfamiliar closeness of so many bodies, the press of humanity. But then, suddenly, the reality hits. A stench so deep and complex it nearly stops your heart. This is the smell that once defined urban life in Europe, the thick layered fog of rotting flesh, burning tallow, and sewage, a living haze so powerful that travelers wrote of it for centuries. The first note is always rot, an undercurrent of putrefying flesh. Even on cold days, the smell lingers, seeping from every butcher's stall, every pile of animal guts tossed carelessly into the street. The medieval city is a place of constant slaughter. Animals are not killed at distant factories or hidden away behind modern sanitation. Instead, sheep, pigs, and cattle are driven through city gates, herded through twisting lanes, and slaughtered in open-air shambles, sometimes right at the front door of the shop. Blood runs in rivulets down the gutters, staining the cobblestones crimson. Offal, livers, lungs, intestines, brains, anything not deemed edible or worth saving, is simply thrown out, left to rot in the open. On a hot day, the air grows heavy with the sweet, sickening perfume of decay. But that's only the beginning. Mingled with the rot is the constant cloying smoke of tallow, rendered animal fat used for everything from candles to soap. Tallow was the oil of the Middle Ages, and its production was relentless. In every city, vats of boiling fat hissed and bubbled, filling the air with an oily smoke that coated walls, clothes, and lungs. Every candle burning in every house, every lamp flickering in a dark tavern, released a little more of that dense, greasy scent. The city itself seemed to sweat tallow. On a crowded night, with hundreds of candles burning, the haze would gather beneath the rafters and pool in the streets, clinging to every surface. The people who lived here, peasants and nobles alike, carried that smell on their skin and in their hair, woven into the very fabric of daily life. And then, always, the sewage. In a world before plumbing, every chamber pot was a weapon. The city's waste flowed through open ditches, poured from upper windows, and collected in cesspits that overflowed after every rain. Visitors to Rouen or Bruges described rivers of filth winding through the streets, sometimes deeper than the wheels of a cart, sometimes so thick with excrement and refuse that you could smell the street before you could see it. Even the grandest squares were not immune. Human waste mixed with the slop from kitchens, the droppings from market animals, and the runoff from tanneries, breweries, and dye houses. Every rainstorm churned it up. Every dry spell baked it into a crust that powdered into the air, coating tongues and teeth with the taste of the city's own filth. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fact of life so powerful it shaped everything. In Rouen, travelers would write home describing how the air seemed to burn their nostrils, how the smell clung to their clothes for days after they left. In Bruges, foreign merchants compared the stench to a battlefield after days of slaughter. The city fathers knew their towns were infamous for their filth, but there was only so much they could do. Attempts to regulate butchers, to move tanneries outside the walls, to enforce fines for dumping waste. These efforts fell apart in the face of daily necessity. Where else could the blood go? Where else could the sewage flow? Everyone, rich and poor, breathed the same air. Even in the grandest cathedrals, incense was burned as much to mask the stink as to honor the divine. There are stories of royal visitors passing through city gates with perfumed cloths pressed to their faces, desperate to block out the worst of it. Ladies carried scented pomanders, balls of herbs, ambergris, and musk, on chains around their necks, clutching them in moments of distress. But these were only masks. The truth was inescapable. The medieval city was a living, breathing organism, and its exhalation was rot, smoke, and waste. For many, this became normal, almost invisible, a background noise to life. Children played in gutters alongside pigs. Rats ran in the rafters and along the roof beams, emboldened by the constant presence of garbage and the easy feast of refuse. Dogs and wild cats tore open heaps of discarded animal guts, scattering them across alleys and squares. In the markets, butchers worked surrounded by swarms of flies and a steady rain of feathers, hair, and offal. The stink was strongest in summer, when the sun turned every pile of refuse into a slow-cooking cauldron. But even in winter, it never truly vanished. And with the stench came sickness. Few understood the connection, but everyone saw the consequences. Outbreaks of plague, typhus, dysentery, and mysterious fevers haunted the medieval city. People blamed bad air, curses, the alignment of the stars, but beneath it all, the cause was simpler and more brutal. A world where filth was unavoidable and cleanliness nearly impossible. The stench was not just a sign of decay, but a warning, the invisible edge of a constant, invisible danger. Industrial waste added another layer of poison. Tanneries soaked hides in urine and lime, releasing chemical fumes and black, foul-smelling water into the streams and ditches. Dyers poured vats of leftover pigment into the canals, turning the water strange colors and adding a sharp chemical tang to the city's reek. Brewers and bakers dumped sour mash and spoiled dough alongside the usual piles of animal remains. In Bruges, chroniclers described the river as running black for days, the fish dying in heaps along the banks, the air unbreathable for half a mile in every direction. It is almost impossible, from the distance of modernity, to imagine living in this world. Today we take for granted the luxury of clean air, the invisible safety net of sanitation, the idea that waste can be contained and removed. But for those who lived in Rouen, Bruges, or any great city of the Middle Ages, the stench was a daily reality, a burden you could never escape. It shaped the way you ate, drank, worked, and prayed. It dictated the architecture of cities, the hours of markets, even the rituals of courtship and celebration. A wedding or festival would be remembered as much for the smell in the air as for the joy of the occasion. And yet, life went on. People adapted, building up a kind of immunity to the worst of it, joking about the city's perfume even as they suffered. They found moments of beauty and joy within the chaos, the bells ringing over the marketplace, the sunlight glancing off the cathedral stones, the sound of laughter rising above the flies and filth. For those who survived, the stench was simply part of the world's fabric, a reminder of life's fragility, its resilience, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. So, the next time you step into a clean street, breathe deep and remember, in another time, in the heart of a city like Rouen or Bruges, every breath was a gamble, every scent a story, every step an act of courage in a world where the very air could turn against you. This was the real Middle Ages, alive, unfiltered, and unforgettable. You could die from stepping on a rusty nail in the street. Imagine walking through a medieval city at dusk. The streets are not the paved, well-lit, carefully swept avenues of the modern world. They are narrow, twisting, unpredictable, cluttered with every imaginable kind of debris. Centuries before modern sanitation, the ground beneath your feet is a patchwork of mud, animal bones, broken pottery, splintered wood, and glinting shards of metal. There is no municipal garbage collection, no warning signs, no one responsible for cleaning up after the chaos of daily life. In every alley and crossing, something dangerous waits, hidden in the dirt, invisible to hurried eyes. It is here, in the ordinary act of walking, that death can be waiting. One misplaced step, One moment of distraction, and you feel the sharp stab of metal through thin leather or bare skin, a nail left from a fallen cart or spilled by a careless craftsman. In a world without antibiotics, what happens next is not a minor injury, but a ticking clock. Medieval shoes offer little protection. Most are little more than soft leather slippers, easily pierced by even a small nail. And feet themselves are battered, calloused, often exposed to the elements. It's easy to imagine the pain, the quick withdrawal, the small wound that doesn't bleed much and seems at first insignificant. In that moment, there is no warning that this is the injury that will end your story. But in the filth and chaos of the street, every wound is a risk, a portal for unseen killers. Few in the medieval world understood infection. The word sepsis didn't exist. No one knew of bacteria or microbes. But people knew what happened to the unlucky. A friend or neighbor steps on a nail or jagged bone. They laugh it off, limp home, wash the wound with whatever water they have. But over the next days, a shadow falls. Pain and swelling, red lines creeping up the leg, fever burning in the night, a wound that will not close, flesh that darkens and smells wrong. The body begins to betray itself. This is blood poisoning, sepsis, though no one would use the word. It is the body's desperate, doomed fight against an enemy it cannot see. With no penicillin, no antibiotics, no effective medicine, infection spreads relentlessly. Sometimes the wound produces pus, thick, yellow, hot. Sometimes the entire limb swells, growing hard and red, the pain so intense that every movement is agony. The victim shivers with chills, sweats through their bedding, drifts in and out of fevered sleep. There is no hospital, no hope of rescue. Physicians, if they come, offer little more than herbs, leeches, or the painful ritual of cauterization, burning the wound with a hot iron in a desperate bid to halt the rot. But most die at home, surrounded by family, the smell of death growing stronger with each passing hour. Medieval chroniclers and surgeons left behind descriptions, chilling, clinical, heartbreaking. There are stories of men and women whose feet, then legs, then entire bodies turned black, swollen, and cold before death finally came. Sometimes the infection would race so quickly that the victim would be dead within a week, delirious with pain and fever. There is no dignity, no peace, only the memory of a nail in the street, a moment's carelessness, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of life. For children, the danger was even greater. They ran barefoot through the streets, playing in filth, their skin thin and vulnerable. A single puncture could end their life. Parents lived with the constant anxiety that a minor scrape could mean tragedy. There are haunting accounts of families torn apart by infections that began as nothing, a small prick or cut, the kind that barely registers in the moment. Why were medieval streets so deadly? It is not just the absence of medicine, but the very nature of city life. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes and nails in open workshops, the waste of their labor scattered across the ground. Butchers discarded animal bones and teeth into the gutter. Carpenters' splinters and shavings drifted into the mud. Storms washed refuse into low-lying areas where it mixed and festered. Streets became morasses of disease, rotting matter, sharp metal, and unseen bacteria. And every day, hundreds or thousands of people walked barefoot or in thin shoes, every step a gamble. The danger did not end with the wound. Without clean water, even the act of washing could make things worse. Water itself was often drawn from contaminated wells, teeming with invisible threats. Medieval attempts at healing, herbal poultices, ointments, sometimes wine or vinegar, could do little more than offer comfort. Sometimes, in desperation, the wound would be lanced or bled. Sometimes priests were summoned to pray or to offer last rites. There were cases when the only way to save a life was to amputate the limb, a brutal, often fatal procedure performed without anesthesia. Many tried to tough it out, convinced the pain would pass, but the fever, once it took hold, was a sign of the body's final battle. The infected would become confused, raving with hallucinations, their skin burning and dry, their minds drifting far from the world. Some would beg for water, others for relief from pain. In the end, most would die in agony, leaving behind families both grief-stricken and terrified, haunted by the knowledge that what killed their loved one was not war or famine, but a nail on the ground. Such deaths were common enough to be unremarkable. Chroniclers rarely recorded the stories of ordinary people lost this way. Yet, in the margins of medieval records, in the letters and chronicles of the time, the pattern is clear. One day a minor wound, the next a funeral. The shadow of death hung over every step, every errand, every game played in the streets. This reality shaped medieval life. People became cautious, superstitious, and resourceful. They crafted shoes with thicker soles when they could afford it. They prayed for protection against bad air and evil spirits, sensing that the streets themselves were alive with danger. Yet, for most, poverty meant thin shoes or none at all, and the risk was ever present. What seems unthinkable now, a life ended by a nail, was routine then. It is a reminder of how fragile life once was and how narrow the margin for error. In a world without antibiotics, with every street littered with debris, death walked silently, hidden in every shadow, every step. Survival was not just a matter of strength or luck, but of navigating a world where even the smallest wound could change everything. The next time you pass over a nail in the road or step carelessly on a piece of glass, consider the invisible web of protection that modern life has spun around you. Shoes that cannot be pierced, vaccines, antiseptics, emergency rooms. For most of history, none of these existed. A simple nail, lying unnoticed in the street, could unravel a future, devastate a family, or silence a child's laughter forever. In the medieval world, the ground itself was a minefield, every step a potential tragedy, every wound a whispered threat from a past that never forgave carelessness. Beggars and thieves were hanged in public squares without mercy. In the world of medieval Europe, the line between survival and death was razor thin. Hunger was a constant companion, and for the poorest, desperation led to choices most of us could never imagine. Yet society's answer to poverty and crime was not mercy, but a display of relentless cruelty, one designed to terrify, to shame, and to remind every living soul who truly held power. Nowhere was this more visible than in the public squares, where the bodies of the condemned were left swinging in the open air, their final agony transformed into a lesson for all. Picture a marketplace at dawn, the stone streets slick with last night's rain, the smell of rotting vegetables and burning tallow drifting on the breeze. The crowd begins to gather, drawn not by hope, but by spectacle, a morbid curiosity that would pass for entertainment. Merchants set aside their wares, children climb onto barrels for a better view, and the city's poorest huddle at the edges, clutching empty bellies, their eyes fixed on the gallows. For today the law will make an example of a thief. A young woman, no older than 20, accused of stealing a single loaf of bread. It is 1367 in the city of Ghent. The harvest has failed, and hunger gnaws at the city's heart. Theft is everywhere. Chickens vanish from yards, cheese from market stalls, bread from windowsills. The authorities are determined to stamp out these crimes, for every theft, however small, is seen as a threat to the fragile social order. And so they choose a target, a girl caught with crusts in her apron, too weak to run, too hungry to beg. Her name, lost to time, is spoken only in whispers now. Some say she was an orphan, others that she once had a family until plague or war took them away. What is certain is this: she was condemned to hang before the city's eyes. There was no lengthy trial, no appeal, no chance of pardon. Justice was swift and absolute, its message as clear as the noose prepared in the chill morning air. The executioner arrives, face hidden beneath a hood, hands practiced and merciless. The condemned is brought forward, her wrist bound, her clothes little more than rags, her eyes wide with the terror of a trapped animal. The crowd surges forward, some jeering, others silent. For some, it is a lesson they pray never to learn firsthand. For others, it is a rare moment when the powerful show their hand. The sentence is read aloud, and for a brief moment, the entire city holds its breath. There is no dignity in her death. The trap is sprung, her body jerks and twists, and as the air leaves her lungs, the silence is broken by gasps, shouts, and even laughter. Mothers shield their children's eyes, but most watch, unable to look away. To the authorities, this is the point: to burn the image of punishment into memory, to teach obedience and fear. For hours the body remains, a stark silhouette against the sky. As the day drags on, the marketplace resumes its business, the dead given no more thought than a broken cart or a stray dog. But the cruelty does not end with death. For days the body is left hanging in the square. It twists in the wind, battered by rain, watched by crows and stray dogs. Those who pass by avert their gaze or mutter a prayer. The message is simple and inescapable. Mercy is weakness, and poverty is a crime to be stamped out with violence. The authorities hope that each passing day will carve the lesson deeper into the bones of the living. The young woman's fate is not unique. Throughout medieval Europe, public executions are as routine as market days, each one a brutal theater of power. Thieves, beggars, and vagrants are dragged from their cells, sometimes beaten, sometimes half-starved, and put to death in front of cheering or indifferent crowds. Sometimes the condemned are children, boys of 12 or 14, whose only crime was picking a pocket or stealing a crust of bread. The punishment is always the same: death by hanging, the body left on display as a warning to others. The authorities believe these executions maintain order, but the reality is more complex. Fear breeds resentment, and for every onlooker who vows to obey the law, there are others who plot in silence, whose hatred simmers and grows. The bodies left to rot in public squares become symbols of injustice as much as deterrents. Ballads are whispered about the poor hanged girl of Ghent, and in the alleys, stories circulate about thieves who slipped the noose or avenged the deaths of friends. The gallows itself becomes a landmark, a place where people gather, not just to watch, but to trade, to gossip, to bear witness to a ritual older than memory. For some, it is a reminder to stay silent, to go hungry rather than risk everything for a mouthful of food. For others, it is proof that the world is cruel and must be survived by any means necessary. The dead are nameless, faceless, their stories washed away by rain and time, but the fear lingers, a silent thread running through every market stall and every darkened alley. In times of unrest, the pace of executions quickens. After riots or famine, the authorities hang dozens, sometimes hundreds, leaving the bodies for days or even weeks. The smell of death mingles with the daily life of the city, seeping into bread, into clothes, into memory. The message is relentless. Mercy is for the powerful and for the weak. There is only the rope. And yet, even as the bodies hang and the crowds disperse, life continues. People return to the marketplace, buy and sell, laugh and grieve. For many, the threat of the gallows is just another part of existence, a danger to be skirted, an ever-present shadow on the edge of every decision. Stories of the hanged girl in Ghent circulate for generations, a warning and a lament, a reminder that in the medieval world, justice is measured not in mercy, but in fear. The square where she died is swept clean, the gallows eventually taken down or replaced, but the lesson endures. In stone carvings, in whispered prayers, in the dreams of those who saw her die. The legacy of public execution is not just in the spectacle, but in the scars it leaves on a society that learns to equate poverty with crime and punishment with spectacle. Every drop of rain that falls on those ancient stones is a witness. Every crow that circles the square remembers. And every time a loaf of bread goes missing, a new story is written in the unyielding script of power and pain. This was the world of medieval Europe, a world where the cost of hunger was often your life and where the only lesson that mattered was the one written in the shadow of the gallows. This is the reality that shaped generations, the echo that lingers in every old square and every faded law book. A world where justice was public, brutal, and merciless, and where, for the poorest, hope was as fleeting as a final breath beneath the gallows tree. There were no doctors, only barbers who cut and bled you. In the world of medieval medicine, survival often meant surrendering yourself to a practice so primitive, so terrifying, that even hope was mixed with dread. Imagine waking one morning with a pounding fever or a pain deep in your belly that won't go away. In today's world, you might call a doctor or visit a clinic. But step into the stone-cold reality of the Middle Ages, and you would find yourself at the mercy of the only medical professional available, the barber surgeon. Barber surgeons were everywhere, recognizable by their striped poles and blood-stained aprons. Unlike today's highly trained doctors, medieval barbers had little formal education. They learned by apprenticeship, not by study of anatomy or science, but by observation and repetition, and often through sheer trial and error. The doctor in town was more likely to be a literate priest or scholar who might offer advice rooted in astrology, ancient philosophy, or the unreadable Latin of Galen's texts. The true work of healing, the touch, the blade, the bleeding, fell to the barber. You would enter a barber's shop for a haircut or shave, but you might also come for a tooth extraction, a wound stitched shut, or an abscess lanced with a hot iron. The same man who trimmed your beard might cut off your infected finger or saw through your shattered leg. Sometimes it was the same set of tools, washed with cold water if you were lucky. The barber's pole itself, red for blood, white for bandages, became a chilling symbol of this blend between cosmetic care and butchery. The core of medieval medicine was the theory of humors. Physicians, when they could be found, believed that health depended on a mystical balance between four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness in this worldview was not a virus or bacteria. It was an imbalance, a corruption, a disturbance of your inner elements. To fix this, the barber surgeon had one main tool: release the bad humors. This meant bloodletting. If you had a fever, they would cut a vein, usually in your arm or sometimes your neck, and let the blood flow into a bowl. You might be weakened, dizzy, on the edge of death. But this was seen as a cleansing, a cure. If you were wealthy, leeches would be attached to your skin, their mouths sucking blood from delicate places while you bit down on a leather strap. If you had a headache, the barber might apply a hot iron to your scalp or slice a wound open to let the poison out. Surgery was crude, with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no understanding of infection. Screams echoed through the narrow streets as men, women, and children endured agony, praying for relief that rarely came. Tools were crude and horrifying: rusty blades, hooks, saws, pincers. The barber's chair became a place of transformation or torment, depending on luck and fate. For a toothache, the barber might wrench the tooth out with force, sometimes breaking the jaw. For a wound, he would sew the flesh with a thick needle, maybe cauterize it with fire to stop the bleeding, leaving scars for life. Amputations were done quickly. Speed was the only defense against shock. Sometimes the barber surgeon would use wine or vinegar to clean a wound, but more often, dirt and infection entered the body. Death from sepsis was common. The barber's authority came not from knowledge, but from necessity. For most people, he was the only hope. Monasteries sometimes provided herbal remedies, but few had access to these sanctuaries. Women practiced folk healing, midwifery, and herbalism, but were often viewed with suspicion, even accused of witchcraft. The barber surgeon's trade was sanctioned by guilds, sometimes regulated by city authorities, but the standards were terrifyingly low. There are stories, documented in the records of medieval towns, of men dying not from their wounds, but from the barber's knife. A cut meant to cure an illness instead caused blood loss, fever, or deadly infection. Children died from infected wounds, mothers bled to death after childbirth, soldiers who survived battle often lost limbs in the barber's chair. In plague years, barber surgeons made their fortunes, lancing buboes and draining pus, all in vain. The dead piled high. And yet, within this horror, there were moments of compassion, even skill. Some barber surgeons developed crude techniques for setting bones, cleaning wounds, or stitching flesh. The craft advanced in fits and starts, through bitter experience and luck. But for most, survival was a matter of chance. If you were strong, your body might recover. If not, no amount of bleeding or cutting would save you. To be sick in the Middle Ages was to risk everything. Your treatment was pain, your recovery uncertain, your only hope the shaky hand of a barber whose tools were as likely to kill as to cure. Medieval medicine was not just primitive, it was a gauntlet of agony, fear, and faith. The line between healing and harm was razor thin, and every visit to the barber surgeon was a roll of the dice with death. Today we look at the striped pole outside a barber shop and see a symbol of grooming. In the Middle Ages, it was a warning. Behind that door, you might lose more than a lock of hair. You might lose your blood, your strength, even your life, sacrificed in the desperate hope of surviving a world where medicine was still a nightmare, and the cure was sometimes more terrifying than the disease itself. The noise never stopped and drove people mad. Try to imagine waking each morning not to birdsong or silence, but to an explosion of sound so dense and relentless it invades your bones. In the heart of a medieval town, York, Paris, Florence, Prague, there was no such thing as quiet. The noise was not a background feature, it was the city's pulse, its weapon, its madness. Step into those streets for even a single day, and the illusion of romantic, peaceful antiquity vanishes. You'll hear what our ancestors truly endured, a wall of sound that could fray nerves, splinter thoughts, and, over years, break the mind. Dawn cracks open not with gentle light, but with the iron clang of blacksmiths pounding tools to life. The hammering is constant, sharp, metallic, echoing off every close-packed wall. 100 forges ring out across the city, sometimes so loud they rattle the windows and shake dust from ceiling beams. Outside, the streets churn with livestock, cattle bellowing, pigs squealing, chickens flapping and crowing in panicked bursts as they're herded toward market squares. The ground itself thrums beneath cartwheels, hooves, and the heavy boots of butchers, bakers, soldiers, beggars, and children. Vendors compete for attention, each voice raised above the last. Fresh bread, eels and lampreys, herbs for healing. The shouts overlap, spiral, clash. News criers bellow out proclamations, illiterate crowds jostling to catch the gist. The grocer's bell rings for a sale, but it's lost beneath the butcher's horn and the racket of tinsmiths banging metal into shape. A nearby tavern opens its doors. Laughter, singing, arguments, and drunken boasts tumble out, merging with the raucous calls of peddlers hawking cloth, shoes, or illicit trinkets from beneath patched cloaks. Above it all, the great church bells command obedience. Some towns had dozens, each tolling the hour, each marking prayers, funerals, weddings, alarms, warnings of fire, warnings of flood, calls to arms, calls to confession. Their peals resound over rooftops, synchronized and discordant all at once, as if heaven itself were shaking the city awake. The sound never dies. It merely shifts, swelling at market hours, thinning at night, but always, always present. No window glass seals you off. Thin shutters block the worst wind, not the sound. Walls are wood or wattle and daub, echoing every cry, every argument from next door. There is no private space, only crowded chambers above crowded shops. Above and below, behind and beside, families fight, laugh, weep, and shout, noise passing through thin floors and walls, a constant chorus of humanity in all its messiness. For the medieval city dweller, there is no escape. The countryside is far, often dangerous. The city is home, and home is loud. The endless noise is more than inconvenience, it's a siege. Chronic insomnia was so common that medieval doctors wrote tracts on sleeplessness of the soul, blaming not just bad air or nightmares, but the assault of sound. The mind, denied rest, starts to fray. People lay awake for hours, their thoughts jumbled, nerves stretched to snapping. Records from city courts and chroniclers reveal a world in which tempers flared and snapped, often over nothing. Fights broke out over the smallest disputes. Feuds grew from sleepless irritation. Men and women broke down in public, ranting at unseen enemies or falling mute with exhaustion. Medieval medical texts describe melancholy and frenzy, blaming bad humors or demonic influence. But beneath the surface, the relentless pressure of noise gnawed at every one. The town never let anyone forget they were not alone. Even the joy was loud. Festivals unleashed drummers, pipers, minstrels, acrobats, the roars of crowds. Wedding processions marched through the streets, filling every corner with music and shouts. Death, too, was public, a funeral with wailing bells, the shuffle of mourners. The only silence came from catastrophe, plague, war, the aftermath of fire, when a hush fell for a day or a week, and the absence of sound became its own terror. Night offered no true peace. As darkness settled, taverns grew rowdier. Thieves and drunken revelers prowled the alleys, shouting and clattering. Watchmen called the hour and warnings, banging staffs on the ground. Dogs barked, cats yowled, and the wind found every crack, whistling with the city's lost secrets. Some people stuffed rags in their ears or pressed pillows over their heads, desperate for sleep. Many could not find it night after night until exhaustion dulled their senses or madness overtook them. Medieval thinkers noticed. Chroniclers wrote about city madness, the peculiar frenzy that afflicted townsfolk, less common in rural villages. Insomnia was so widespread it became a metaphor for spiritual struggle, priests warning that only the truly virtuous would ever find peace, in this world or the next. For the common person, it meant living with constant irritability, foggy memory, a sense of always being on the edge. Some retreated into monasteries, craving the rare promise of silence. But most endured, adapting to the ceaseless din in strange ways. Some found comfort in the noise, proof that life, for all its hardship, was everywhere. Children grew up learning to sleep through the chaos. Old women learned to distinguish the voices, knowing which bell meant a wedding, which meant disaster. Yet for many, the price was high. Shattered sleep, anxious minds, tempers quick to ignite. A few lost themselves entirely, wandering the streets, muttering to invisible foes, or falling into silence so complete it frightened even their neighbors. This is the real medieval city, alive, chaotic, and deafening. Every step was an exercise in endurance. Every night was a gamble. Modern life, with its insulated walls and hum of distant traffic, cannot compare. The noise never stopped. And in its endless echo, the city shaped its people, forging resilience but also exacting a quiet, relentless toll, a toll that left scars on the mind as deep as any wound of war or plague. And yet, each morning, the bells rang out again, and life went on, one roar at a time. Tooth infections could kill you in days. Imagine the sharp, sudden ache in your jaw, the kind that wakes you up at night, throbbing, relentless. You put your hand to your face, hoping it's nothing. But in the medieval world, that pain is the beginning of a silent nightmare. There are no dentists to call, no numbing injections, no x-rays or antiseptics. Just pain, fear, and the slow, steady march towards something far worse. In the centuries before modern medicine, a simple toothache could kill you in a matter of days, and there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it. Life in a medieval town is hard on the body in ways we struggle to imagine. Bread is coarse and full of grit from grinding stones. Meat is rare, often tough, and sometimes eaten half-rotten. Sugar, when it appears, is a luxury for the very rich, but honey and dried fruits make the rounds. Oral hygiene, as we know it, is non-existent. People use twigs or cloth to rub their teeth, sometimes chewing fragrant herbs to mask the smell of decay. But in the end, it isn't enough. Teeth crack, rot, and die. Sometimes the pain is a constant background noise, sometimes it flares into agony. And when that happens, there are no dental clinics, no professionals whose job is to fix what's broken. The best you can hope for is a barber surgeon or a local tooth puller, often a blacksmith, a midwife, or someone who's learned the brutal art by trial and error. In the square before a jeering crowd, the suffering man or woman sits in a wooden chair, gripping the arms with white knuckles. Iron pliers or forceps are jammed into the mouth. There is no anesthetic, only the hope that the pain of extraction will be brief compared to the torture of leaving the tooth to rot. But many people never get that far. Maybe the tooth can't be pulled. Maybe the sufferer is too afraid, or the infection is already too advanced. It starts as an ache, a throb, a swelling at the gum line. But in a world with no antibiotics, no antiseptics, the infection is a wildfire waiting to spread. The abscess grows, filling with pus. The gum swells, turning purple and then black. The pain is blinding, driving people to madness. Sometimes desperate souls cut into their own flesh, trying to drain the poison. Sometimes folk healers try poultices or herbs, sage, salt, vinegar, even prayers whispered in the dark. But none of it is enough. The reality is brutal. Once an abscess forms, bacteria find a path into the bloodstream. What began as a toothache turns into fever. The face swells grotesquely. The pain radiates up to the eye, down into the neck, and across the jaw. Swallowing becomes agony. Breathing is hard. The infection travels fast, following blood vessels straight to the heart, brain, or lungs. Medieval people called it the jaw death, the mouth fever, or simply the curse. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes a week. But without intervention, the outcome is almost always the same: delirium, unconsciousness, and death. Historians estimate that a significant percentage of people in the Middle Ages and Renaissance died from dental infections, though their deaths were rarely recorded as such. Fever, consumption, or unknown illness fills the church records, but archaeological digs reveal the truth: skulls with deep untreated cavities, abscess scars on the jaw, and evidence of horrific, prolonged suffering. In some cases, abscesses burst through the jaw or palate, creating open holes that never healed. The victim may have survived the infection, but at the cost of permanent disfigurement and ongoing pain. Others weren't so lucky. For many, the first sign of infection was the beginning of the end. The fear of dental pain haunted every social class. Peasants suffered, but so did kings and queens. Letters and chronicles from across Europe tell stories of powerful men and women brought low by a single rotten tooth. In 1558, Queen Elizabeth I suffered so terribly from tooth pain that her entire court was thrown into chaos. She refused to let a tooth puller near her mouth, and the pain became so great that one bishop volunteered to have a tooth pulled himself, just to show her it could be survived. She relented, but her agony was a reminder to everyone. No amount of power or wealth could truly shield you from the dangers lurking in your own mouth. Without modern dentistry, prevention was mostly guesswork. Some cultures tried rinsing with wine or vinegar. In parts of the world, people chewed sticks of specific woods, hoping their natural oils would keep rot at bay. Superstitions grew. Some believed that carrying certain stones, charms, or bones could ward off toothache. Others blamed demons, curses, or moral failings. But the underlying truth was inescapable. If infection set in, the clock started ticking, and no prayer could guarantee survival. The pain itself could be so severe that people went mad. Medieval texts describe sufferers raving, tearing at their own faces, or wandering the streets sleepless and hallucinating. In some towns, chronic dental pain was seen as a punishment from God or a mark of secret sin. Sufferers could be shunned, isolated, or even accused of witchcraft. Children died from abscesses that swelled until their throats closed. Pregnant women, weakened by infection, lost their lives and their babies. The only relief was temporary: a poultice of herbs, a mouthful of strong wine, or the numbness that comes just before death. It's difficult for us to imagine, in an age where a dentist's office is never far away, how terrifying a toothache once was. The threat was constant, invisible, lurking behind every meal and every careless fall. Even a chipped tooth from stale bread could become a death sentence. Families watched loved ones fade, powerless to help, forced to witness the slow, relentless march of infection from mouth to heart, from a simple cavity to the end of everything. Sometimes the desperate sought help from traveling healers, charlatans, or religious shrines. Pilgrims carried stories of miraculous cures, hoping for relief at the hands of a saint's relic or a holy well. Some monasteries became known for their dental remedies, mixing herbs and prayers in equal measure. But for most, death came quietly, in the night, surrounded by the scent of pus and fever, the face swollen and disfigured, the pain at last replaced by silence. The legacy of this suffering lasted for centuries. When dentistry finally emerged as a profession, it was greeted with awe and gratitude. The first true dentists, armed with crude drills and improved instruments, became legends in their own lifetimes. In some cities, the introduction of better hygiene, tooth powders, and eventually antibiotics transformed the very nature of life and death. But the memory of those earlier times, when a toothache meant agony, fear, and the very real possibility of a rapid, unexplainable death, never fully faded from the collective mind. The next time you run your tongue across your teeth or feel a sudden ache in your jaw, remember, you live in an age of miracles. For most of human history, the smallest infection could kill, and the line between life and death was drawn across the surface of a single tooth. Every smile, every meal, every untroubled night's sleep is a victory over a danger that once haunted every home, every village, every crowded, anxious city street. History is not just made in palaces or on battlefields. It's written in the silent suffering of people who endured pain beyond imagining, and in the quiet triumph of a world where toothaches are just an inconvenience and not a death sentence. Street violence was common and random. The medieval city street was a place of unending motion, color, and noise, but beneath that surface energy, it hid a darkness just as old as the stones beneath your feet. In a world without reliable law enforcement, where personal honor was everything and disputes simmered just beneath the surface, violence could erupt at any moment, fast, ugly, and without warning. Walking through a crowded market, a tavern, or a busy town square in the 14th century was stepping into a world wired for conflict. Every jostle could be a provocation, every glance a challenge, every word misheard the spark for disaster. Alcohol was a staple, the streets were cramped, tempers short, and the weapons, knives, clubs, even swords, were never far from hand. Fistfights, stabbings, and mass brawls were as much a part of medieval urban life as the church bell or the toll of the town crier. The average person was always on alert, watching for trouble. It could begin anywhere, a tavern after dark, a crowded market day, a feast, a wedding, even a churchyard. Often it began with a word, an insult, or a spilled drink, but it could also start with nothing at all. A stranger's face mistaken for someone else, a local resenting the presence of a foreigner or a student, or a rivalry that had gone on for years. Grudges were remembered, slights magnified by stories, and the streets offered no sanctuary. The medieval town was a pressure cooker, and it didn't take much for the lid to blow. The most notorious example, seared into English memory, exploded in Oxford, 1355, on St. Scholastica's Day. It began with a dispute so trivial it might have been a joke. Two Oxford students in a local tavern tasted the wine and loudly declared it to be bad. The tavern keeper, stung by their words, argued back. Voices rose, insults flew, and within moments, fists and then weapons were drawn. What started as a petty squabble transformed, in minutes, into open war between the town's students and its working-class residents. The line between student and local was more than social. It was a simmering rivalry fueled by envy, resentment, and privilege. Students were often the sons of wealthy families, protected by university charters, and often behaving as if the law did not apply. Locals saw them as arrogant, entitled, untouchable. Fights were common, but on this night, the violence reached a fever pitch. As the brawl erupted, news spread like wildfire. Townsfolk rushed to defend their own, some armed with staves and axes. Students poured from colleges, wielding swords, bows, anything they could lay hands on. The narrow streets became battlegrounds, windows shattered, doors splintered. By nightfall, the city was in chaos. Arrows flew through the darkness, men died in alleys, and no one knew who would live to see the dawn. The bloodshed lasted through the night and into the next day. Bands of students barricaded themselves in colleges, while townspeople armed themselves and stormed the buildings. By the time order was restored, at least 63 people lay dead, students, townsmen, even a few hapless bystanders. Some were hacked down in the street, others died defending their homes or their classmates. For days the city reeled, its streets haunted by the memory of violence that had come out of nowhere without mercy or logic. This was not an isolated tragedy. Medieval records are littered with tales of sudden violence. In London, Paris, Florence, Bruges, wherever people crowded together, bloodshed was never far away. There were few police. What passed for law was often corrupt, brutal, or simply absent. When fights broke out, the outcome was determined not by justice, but by who had more friends, more weapons, or more luck. Afterward, there might be a fine, a brief imprisonment, or just another feud added to the city's tangled web of grudges. Taverns, the social heart of every city, were especially dangerous after dark. Beer and wine blurred boundaries and stoked resentments. Songs became shouts, shouts became shoves, and shoves became knives. Some brawls involved dozens, others just two desperate men, but all carried the risk of sudden death. It wasn't just men. Records exist of women taking up knives, pots, or anything at hand to defend themselves or join the chaos. For many, violence was a part of life from childhood. Boys learned to fight in the streets. Guilds had their own loyalties and codes, and defending your own meant everything. Disputes could turn deadly over a few coins, a game of dice, a stolen glance, or a long-remembered insult. The city's narrow lanes and blind alleys were perfect for ambushes. Sometimes, victims were left bleeding and alone, or dragged away by friends to die in secret, their killers vanishing into the crowds. Weapons were everywhere. Swords and daggers hung at the belts of students and merchants. Butchers and carpenters carried their tools, which doubled as weapons. Even the stones of the street became missiles. In many towns, the sound of a fight, a sudden cry, the crash of wood, the sharp report of metal was so common that most people barely looked up unless the violence came too close. The aftermath was grim. Blood soaked into the mud. Bodies were carried away, sometimes to be buried in haste, sometimes left as warnings. Mothers wept, widows cursed the city, and neighbors whispered about the dangers lurking in the night. City officials made grand statements about order and justice, but little changed. The next night, another fight might start, another life ended before it had truly begun. In this world, even the simple act of stepping outside was an act of courage. You learned to keep your back to the wall, to watch every shadow, to judge the mood of a crowd before daring to speak. Everyone had a story of a friend or relative maimed, blinded, or killed by random violence. Even the mightiest could fall. Nobles assassinated in alleyways, clergy beaten on the way to church, students cut down before their studies were finished. This constant threat shaped the very way people lived. Laws against carrying weapons in town were passed, then ignored. Fines for street violence were issued, but rarely collected. Feuds passed from one generation to the next. The line between justice and vengeance blurred, and mercy was often seen as weakness. In the end, it was not the king or the constable who kept the peace, but fear, caution, and the understanding that anyone could be next. In modern times, we imagine the medieval world as a place of chivalry and order, but the truth is far more raw. Every city was a powder keg, every gathering a gamble, every day a test of nerves. The shadows between street lamps, the silence after a tavern brawl, the sound of footsteps behind you in a dark lane. All were reminders that violence was never far away, that life was fragile, and that death could come, quick and senseless, out of the chaos of the crowd. The St. Scholastica Day riot at Oxford in 1355 is just one name in a long, grim litany. It stands as a warning. In a world without safety nets, the line between life and death could be as thin as a word, a drink, or a step in the wrong direction. That reality shaped every moment, every decision, every heartbeat, and its echoes linger in the stones of the oldest streets to this day. You could be crushed in a festival crowd. In medieval Europe, a festival day was a rare promise of joy, a pause from hunger, toil, and plague, a chance to join neighbors in celebration and prayer. Yet beneath the music, banners, and dazzling processions, every festival hid a silent threat, as dangerous as war or famine. In the crowded heart of a city, one moment of panic could transform joy into horror, laughter into screams, and hope into suffocating darkness. And when the drums of Corpus Christi thundered through Seville in 1390, the city would never forget how quickly celebration could turn to catastrophe. Imagine the anticipation building for weeks, the narrow streets hung with ribbons and embroidered cloth, balconies crowded with faces hungry for spectacle. Everyone, old and young, rich and poor, pressed toward the city's main square, pulled by the promise of holy spectacle and perhaps a crumb of bread or a coin tossed from a nobleman's window. From the first light of dawn, crowds surged from all quarters, packing the market lanes and alleys every inch thick with bodies. In the Spanish sun, the air grew heavy, the dust choking, the shouts and laughter a wave of sound that rolled and broke against ancient walls. Corpus Christi was the grandest procession of all. The host was carried through the city in shimmering golden vessels, guarded by priests and candle-bearers, soldiers and city officials. At the head marched children dressed as angels, their faces solemn in the heat, followed by nobles in embroidered silks, their perfumes mixing with the scent of sweat and incense. Music filled the streets, drums, bells, flutes, and overhead banners snapped in the summer wind. For the poor, the festival was a chance to glimpse a world of splendor. For the pious, it was a moment to witness a living miracle. But for the city's most desperate, packed together in the side streets, it was also a fight for breath, for space, for survival. Merchants shouted, trying to keep their stalls from being swept away. Vendors hawked honey cakes and candied nuts. Children darted between legs. Thieves slipped hands into purses. The excitement was infectious and unstoppable. As the procession advanced, more people joined from every side, pressing forward for a glimpse of the sacred host. The crush grew tighter, bodies squeezed shoulder to shoulder, each person trapped by the weight of the crowd behind them. Those near the front were pinned against wooden barriers, unable to move or even turn. Children were lifted onto shoulders, but others were caught at knee-height, crying out as they were squeezed and jostled. For many, there was no choice. If you faltered, if you stumbled, the wave behind would push you down and never stop. And then, somewhere near the Plaza de San Francisco, the first cry went up. Perhaps a child lost her footing, perhaps a horse reared, perhaps someone shouted, "Fire!" In these moments, panic spreads like wildfire. A single scream ripples through the mass, a surge runs through the crowd, and suddenly order gives way to chaos. People push forward, desperate to escape, but there is nowhere to go. The crowd tightens, people gasp for breath, arms flailing, voices lost in the press. Some stumble and fall, vanishing beneath a tide of trampling feet. Witnesses would later describe the terror, a living wall of bodies crushing inward with such force that ribs snapped, lungs collapsed, and the unlucky were trampled into the dust. Mothers lost hold of children, lovers were torn apart, friends vanished in the chaos. The music faltered, priests shouted for calm, but panic was already in control. In minutes, dozens were crushed, pinned between stone and flesh, their cries drowned by the crowd's frantic roar. All the city's faith and ritual could not stop what had been unleashed. When the panic finally ebbed, the festival square was transformed. The gold of the procession was spattered with mud and blood, banners trampled, wooden barriers splintered. Survivors staggered away, faces dazed, clothes torn, searching for loved ones who would never return. Priests hurried through the crowd, offering last rites to the dying, their words lost in the sobs and wails that filled the summer air. And for days the city mourned, not in silence, but in the stunned confusion of a people who had glimpsed how fragile joy could be. Authorities investigated, but in truth, no one was ever to blame. It was God's will, they whispered, a warning, a test. City fathers ordered new barricades, more guards, wider streets for the next procession. But each year, the fear lingered. People remembered the thunder of the crowd, the moment when the world shrank to a breathless, crushing press, and life itself was reduced to the struggle to stand upright, to reach the next gasp of air. This was not the first time a festival had turned deadly. nor would it be the last. Across medieval Europe, stories echoed of coronation crowds trampled to death, of churches packed so tightly that those at the back suffocated in the summer heat, of market fairs where a single shout could send hundreds to their doom. The chroniclers wrote with horror of the aftermath: bodies stacked in corners, shoes and hats scattered in the dust, family members searching among the fallen for a familiar face. The psychology of the medieval crowd was raw, primal, and terrifying. In an age without police lines, loudspeakers or crowd control, safety depended on luck and the mercy of strangers. The desire to witness the miraculous, to be part of something larger than yourself, could sweep away all caution. Once the panic began, even the strongest were helpless. The weight of 100 bodies could crush the life from anyone, and the festival square would become a tomb for those unlucky enough to fall. In the years that followed the 1390 tragedy in Seville, laws were passed to limit the size of processions, to design wider roads, to ban horses from the most crowded routes. But every new festival revived the old fear, and every parent remembered the day when celebration turned to disaster. The city's memory was long, and the shadow of the festival crush hung over every Corpus Christi for centuries. The joy of music and banners was forever tempered by the knowledge that, in the blink of an eye, the crowd could become the most deadly force of all. Medieval life was a constant negotiation with fate. Every gathering, every feast, every parade was a gamble. In a world where fire, famine, and plague could strike without warning, even joy itself carried the seeds of tragedy. Yet the people returned again and again to the festival squares to sing, to pray, to remember, and perhaps to forget the weight of fear for just one day. For the risk of being crushed in the crowd was the price they paid for a glimpse of beauty, a moment of transcendence, and the hope that, just this once, joy would not turn to sorrow. You could be beaten by a guild for selling without permission. 0. Imagine the cobbled streets of medieval Ghent in the year 1371, alive with the clangor of craftsmen and the thick scents of bread, leather, and smoke. Every corner pulses with commerce, carpenters, butchers, weavers, all plying their ancient trades. But beneath this bustling scene lies a brutal, invisible law. The markets are ruled not by free exchange, but by the iron grip of guilds, who act as both gatekeepers and enforcers. To sell a single shoe or loaf of bread without their blessing was to challenge the entire social order, and the price of defiance was nothing short of public humiliation and pain. In medieval Europe, the guilds were powerful collectives, brotherhoods of craftsmen, artisans, and merchants who controlled who could work, what could be sold, how it was made, and crucially, who was allowed to profit. These were not just social clubs or unions. They held authority backed by both the city council and often the church itself. For the average craftsman, joining a guild was not a choice. It was a necessity for survival. Guild membership meant protection, access to tools and materials, and the right to stand in the market. But it came at a cost: strict rules, high entry fees, and loyalty that bordered on fanaticism. Now picture a newcomer, perhaps a young cobbler fleeing famine from a distant village, arriving in Ghent with little more than a bundle of hand-stitched shoes and a desperate hope. He knows he must eat. He must pay for shelter. So, risking everything, he sets up a tiny stall near the marketplace, outside the tightly controlled guild zone, hoping no one will notice. But the guilds notice everything. Their men, more watchful than the city guard, patrol the streets, searching for threats to their monopoly. They spot him, this outsider daring to work without permission, and the punishment begins. Guilds did not simply report infractions. They believed in public discipline, an act of violence staged as a lesson for all. The cobbler is seized and dragged before a crowd. There is no trial, no city magistrate to appeal to, no sympathy from the watching townsfolk who know the consequences of questioning guild authority. The enforcers, strong men, often armed, strip him to the waist, tie his hands, and beat him with rods or whips. The crowd is meant to witness, to learn. Here is what happens to those who trespass on the guild's domain. It doesn't end with physical pain. The guild's message must be burned into memory, literally and symbolically. The man's goods, his precious shoes, his tools, his entire chance at survival, are heaped into a pile and set alight. Flames consume not only his work, but his dignity and hope. In the smoke, the authority of the guild grows only stronger. To the watching apprentices and journeymen, it's a warning. The guild's monopoly is absolute, and mercy is weakness. This violence was not random. It was ritualized, woven into the fabric of market life. The guilds enforced their power because their very survival depended on it. Every unlicensed craftsman was an existential threat, a rival who could undercut prices, disrupt the strict order of apprenticeship, or erode the carefully maintained quality and reputation of the guild. Allowing one outsider to sell could inspire others to do the same, fracturing the fragile web of control that held the city together. Guild justice, brutal as it was, found support from city officials who relied on the guilds to maintain order, pay taxes, and keep the economy stable. The church often blessed the guild's authority, framing their discipline as a defense of moral order. The result was a society where opportunity was guarded by violence and tradition enforced by pain. For many, the guild was a brotherhood, support, friendship, a path to security. For outsiders, it was a wall topped with iron spikes. There are stories hidden in city records of men and women ruined for the simple act of selling without license. Some tried to resist, organizing underground markets, but were discovered and punished. Others tried to buy their way in, but the entry fees, years of service, mountains of silver, were too steep for most. Many simply gave up, moving on to another town or sinking into poverty. The punishment was often repeated: flogging, the destruction of goods, public humiliation. Sometimes the guild would mark the offender, branding them or cutting their hair, ensuring that everyone would know their shame. The medieval marketplace was a stage for both prosperity and cruelty. The same hands that crafted wonders could deliver pain. The lessons of the guilds were carved not only into the laws of commerce, but into the bodies and souls of those who dared to challenge them. The fear they instilled was both a tool and a legacy, a way to keep the peace and a way to crush the spirit of anyone who dreamed of a better life. Today, when we imagine the freedom of markets, it's easy to forget that once every loaf of bread and every shoe sold was shadowed by the threat of violence, the roar of a crowd, and the crack of a whip. The cobbler in 1371. Ghent was not just punished for breaking a rule, he was sacrificed as a warning, a message that in this world permission was everything, and mercy belonged only to those who already had power. The echoes of his suffering remind us how fragile freedom really is, and how easily it can be traded for the illusion of order. Winter meant starvation for the poor and rotting food for the rich. Winter arrives in the medieval world not as a postcard. Snow-dusted fields, cozy fires, laughter echoing from stone halls, but as an enemy, silent and relentless. It doesn't just chill the bones. It turns every meal into a desperate calculation, every empty plate into a warning. For the poor, winter is a season of slow starvation. For the rich, it's a season of rot. Hunger and sickness cross every threshold, leaving few untouched. Imagine December in a one-room cottage on the edge of a frozen village. The wind howls through cracks in the walls and around the loose doorframe. A family huddles together, not for warmth. There's barely enough firewood to last the week, but to conserve energy, to share what little body heat they have. Food is scarce. The last of the rye bread has turned hard and sour, speckled with mold they scrape off with knives, already dulled by weeks of cutting roots and bone. They chew it anyway. It's that or nothing. The root cellar, once overflowing after autumn's harvest, is nearly empty. The turnips have gone soft, the potatoes sprout eyes, the onions rot from the inside. Grain is precious, saved for the thinnest gruel, stretched with anything they can find. Herbs dug from frozen earth, scraps of dried leaves, sometimes even sawdust. Children whimper in their sleep, bellies bloated from hunger. Parents wake in the darkness, haunted by choices: ration food more strictly, or feed the youngest first. Let the old starve quietly in the corner or risk a trip through snowdrifts to beg from wealthier neighbors. There is meat sometimes, but it's a last resort. Rats scurry along the rafters, and the bravest or most desperate will set traps. A few hours over the fire, and even the tough flesh becomes edible. Some families boil shoe leather, scraping every trace of sustenance. Salted fish is rare, dried beans a luxury. Even if a family manages to catch a bird or rabbit, it might already be half rotten, its meat sour with the tang of decay. Hunger turns the stomach iron. Survival means accepting what the mouth rejects. Yet across the frozen street, the wealthy face a different struggle. They sit in rooms barely warmer than outside, surrounded by stone and cold drafts, but their pantries are full, at least at first. Cured meats hang from hooks, salted and smoked to survive the long months, but insulation is poor. Mice and mold find every weakness. Hams sweat, cheese cracks, sausages drip with condensation. The larder, pride of the house, becomes a breeding ground for invisible enemies. Mold creeps along bread, blue and green. Grain bins grow damp, infested by weevils and mice. Joints of beef intended for feasts develop a sour smell. The wealthy eat anyway. The risk of illness is the cost of opulence. Banquets continue, trays of roast meats, thick sauces to mask the taste of spoilage, heavy spices to numb suspicion. Guests grow sick, but etiquette demands silence. Some die of winter fever, sudden chills and sweats that sweep through the house. They blame bad air, or fate, or the wrath of saints. Doctors write of putrid fevers and stomach corruption, but their remedies, herbs, prayers, potions, do little to stem the tide. Foodborne illness doesn't care about status. Rich and poor alike spend long nights doubled over in pain, feverish and weak. Some survive, many do not. The graveyard fills with bodies, and the town whispers about curses or witches or sins that brought the winter down. Markets offer little relief. By January, most vendors are gone, their wares exhausted. Anything left fetches outrageous prices. A handful of beans for a silver coin, a moldy apple for the cost of a day's labor. City authorities pass laws against hoarding and price gouging, but enforcement is weak. Smugglers thrive. Bread is stretched with bark and old flour, often adulterated with chalk or lye to whiten the crumb. Even the baker's apprentices steal crusts to feed their families. Stories echo through the alleys and lanes, of neighbors who disappeared, of families who never lit a fire again, of children found cold in the fields. Some mothers abandon infants at monastery doors, hoping for a miracle. Hunger drives theft, violence, despair. Old rivalries flare as survival instinct overwhelms tradition and neighborly bonds. But the season doesn't just destroy bodies. It shatters minds. Chronic hunger brings nightmares, hallucinations. Despair seeps into every conversation. The poor dread the howling wind, praying for the faint warmth of spring. The rich, surrounded by spoiled food and sickly children, wonder if their fortune is a curse. Some go mad with guilt, others with fear. A few retreat into prayer or seek out wise women and wandering monks for hope. Through all this, life continues. Songs are sung beside dying fires, and stories are told to comfort the youngest. Neighbors pool their last resources, sharing thin soup and harder bread. Occasionally, charity arrives, a gift from a distant lord, a barrel of salted fish from a merchant ship, a blessing from the church in the form of bread and cheese. These gifts are rare and always too little, but sometimes they're enough to keep hope alive. The arrival of spring is not marked by celebration, but by a slow, exhausted relief. Survivors stagger into the thawing light, counting losses, burying their dead. Fields are plowed by hands weakened by months of hunger. The scars remain. Empty beds, sunken eyes, the memory of hunger that never truly fades. Winter in the medieval world is a trial for all. For the poor, it means facing the edge of starvation and eating what they must to survive, spoiled bread, rats, roots. For the rich, it means choking down, luxury turned rotten, suffering the sickness their wealth cannot prevent. In every home, hunger is a presence, silent, patient, and cruel, waiting for the weak, testing the strong, and reminding all that, in the end, no one truly escapes its grasp. Dirty chimneys. Exploded and burned entire homes. Equal sign. Picture a medieval city at dusk. Narrow timber-framed houses huddle together beneath a patchwork of thatched roofs. Smoke seeps from hundreds of crooked chimneys, curling into the twilight. But behind this tranquil scene lies a hidden danger, one that turned peaceful evenings into nightmares, the ever-present risk of fire. In the Middle Ages, a dirty chimney was not just a nuisance. It was a time bomb, a deadly threat lurking in the heart of every home. When it exploded, entire neighborhoods could be erased in a matter of hours. In 1274, in the city of Canterbury, that nightmare became reality. To understand the terror of medieval fire, start with the chimneys themselves. Unlike today's carefully engineered stacks, medieval chimneys were often rough, uneven, and hastily built. The earliest chimneys in England began to appear around the 12th century, replacing open hearths and central holes in the roof. They were a symbol of progress, a way to channel smoke out of crowded wooden houses. But few people understood the dangers lurking inside. Every fire lit for warmth or cooking sent a storm of sparks and soot up the chimney shaft. Over time, a thick, sticky layer of creosote built up on the stone and brick. This black residue was highly flammable, clinging to every crevice, and few, if any, thought to clean it. Chimney sweeps were almost unknown. Most people saw soot as a simple annoyance, not a harbinger of disaster. The buildup grew with every passing week, layer upon layer, until the slightest spark could trigger catastrophe. The houses themselves were perfectly primed for disaster. Walls were timber, floors were dry boards, roofs a patchwork of straw, reeds, or heather, thatch that ignited at the touch of a hot cinder. Homes leaned into one another, sharing walls and squeezing into whatever space the city allowed. In places like Canterbury, York, or London, streets were so narrow that neighbors could reach across and shake hands from opposing upper windows. Fires, when they started, had endless fuel. It didn't take much to set off the chain reaction. A careless cook might stoke the fire too high, or a child might poke at the embers. Sometimes it was nothing more than a gust of wind at the wrong moment. When flames licked the creosote-soaked chimney, the effect was explosive. A sudden roar, a fountain of sparks, and then the horror of realization as flames shot out of the chimney top and danced across the thatched roof. Panic spread instantly. Bells clanged, people screamed, buckets were filled and thrown in desperate haste. But the reality was brutal. Medieval towns had no organized fire brigades, no hydrants or hoses, and little hope of containing a blaze once it began. Water had to be carried by hand, passed in shaky lines from the nearest well or stream. The best a family could hope for was to save a few belongings before the roof collapsed in a shower of fire and ash. In Canterbury in 1274, a single neglected chimney became the spark that doomed an entire block. The fire began in a cramped kitchen just as dusk fell. The flames raced up the flue, igniting months, perhaps years, of caked soot. In minutes, the chimney spat fire onto the thatch, which lit like dry tinder. The wind caught the flames and carried them to the neighboring roof, and then another. Within an hour, a corridor of fire carved through the city, devouring home after home. The night sky glowed red, smoke rising in a column visible for miles. Families ran into the streets, clutching children and whatever they could carry. The sound was a roar, the crackle of burning timber, the crash of collapsing beams, the cries of panic. Chickens, pigs, and dogs scattered in terror. Sometimes the fire leapt the street entirely, setting alight homes on both sides at once. Chroniclers describe the devastation in stunned tones, dozens of houses reduced to blackened skeletons, entire families losing everything they owned, the city transformed into a landscape of smoldering ruin. Ash drifted down for days. In the aftermath, The fortunate picked through debris, hoping to find something spared by the flames. But for many, the disaster was total. This was not an isolated event. All across medieval Europe, dirty chimneys and flammable roofs combined to create a cycle of fire and rebuilding that shaped the very landscape of towns. In London, a fire in 1212 killed thousands. In York, in Norwich, in Paris, cities burned and rose again, each time with a new layer of caution, but rarely enough to stop it from happening again. Fire was a fact of life, a threat that loomed with every spark, every winter night, every meal cooked over an open flame. In the wake of disaster, townsfolk searched for answers. Some saw the fire as punishment from God, a sign of sin or neglect. Others blamed neighbors, strangers, or bad luck. But gradually, a new awareness began to take hold. Regulations appeared, laws mandating regular chimney cleaning, bans on thatched roofs in city centers, requirements for stone or tile. Watchmen were appointed to patrol the streets at night, searching for signs of smoke or flame. In some towns, bells were rung at sunset to remind families to cover their hearths for the night. Curfew, from the French couvre-feu, literally cover the fire. But even as knowledge grew, the risk never vanished. Most people were poor, unable to afford safer materials or proper repairs. Chimney sweeps remained rare and expensive. Old habits persisted, and every winter brought new danger. For children growing up in these cities, the fear of fire was etched into memory, a story told in the ashes of vanished homes, the ruins that lingered for years, the neighbors who disappeared in a single night. The lesson of Canterbury's fire, and hundreds like it, was painfully clear. The comforts of warmth and cooking came with a hidden price. Every hearth was a risk, every chimney a possible fuse. The fight against fire was never-ending, a battle fought with brooms and buckets, prayers and vigilance, and the hope that tonight, at least, the spark would not find its mark. Today, fire safety is built into every wall, every law, every routine cleaning. We forget how new this is, how recently the danger hovered over every evening meal and every sleeping child. The next time you sit by a fireplace or watch smoke drift harmlessly from a chimney, remember, in another age, that quiet comfort was a source of terror, and the cost of forgetting could be the end of everything you knew. You could be forced into a mob or militia with no choice. Imagine it is the dead of night in a medieval town. The air is thick with wood smoke and unease. In the darkness, heavy fists pound on doors. Lanterns bob in the street. Voices shout your name, and you know, before you even open your eyes, that your time has come. This is not a summons you can refuse. This is not an invitation. Tonight, you are to become a soldier or a rioter or a tool for someone else's war. It does not matter that you are a cobbler, a weaver, a farmer, or just a boy barely grown. You are not given a choice. Across medieval Europe, this story was lived by millions. Every town, whether large or small, kept a list, an oral roster, of the men who could be called upon to defend the city walls or crush an uprising. In times of peace, the town militia was almost invisible, its members lost in the crowd of daily life. But when the bells rang out, when rumor of rebellion or invasion swept through the streets, ordinary men were wrenched from their homes, thrust into a violence they did not choose. Picture the town crier's bell echoing through narrow, cobbled lanes. In the villages of England, France, the German states, the Low Countries, the cry was always the same: "To arms!" No one was immune. Guildsmen, apprentices, even the poor, everyone was expected to serve. Refusal could mean prison, a beating, or worse, the suspicion of cowardice or treason. Fathers and sons might be torn apart. Sometimes, the summons came as an order delivered by men with cudgels and grim faces who dragged you out bodily if you hesitated. There are stories recorded in surviving town chronicles of men hiding under beds or in cellars only to be discovered and thrown into the street. Some ran, but the militia would hunt them down. Others, too afraid or resigned, went quietly. What awaited was rarely noble. You might be handed a pike, a spear, or more likely, a farm tool, a scythe or pitchfork. In desperate times, men went to war with kitchen knives lashed to sticks or with shovels as shields. Armor was scarce. Helmets, if provided, were battered, ill-fitting. Sometimes the only protection was a thick woolen tunic and luck. Your leaders were not always experienced soldiers, but local guildmasters, minor officials, or the most dangerous men in town. Orders were shouted in confusion. Drums and bells sounded through the chaos, barely louder than the pounding of your heart. Training was a luxury. Most towns held only occasional musters, where men stumbled through half-remembered drills in muddy fields, more a show of force than real preparation. When violence truly erupted, whether it was a peasant rebellion, an attack by bandits, or the opening salvo of a war, you faced it with trembling hands, staring at neighbors who were just as frightened as you. In peasant uprisings, the line between mob and militia vanished. Anger against lords and officials simmered for years. When it boiled over, the call to arms was not a request, but a demand. Men were pressed into mobs that stormed manor houses, burned crops, or clashed with professional soldiers. Some joined willingly, driven by fury or desperation. But many others marched with dread, knowing that to stay behind was to risk being labeled a traitor, a coward, or an enemy of the people. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is one of history's most famous examples. The rebellion surged through the countryside like wildfire, and as villages emptied into the roads, many of those who joined the march on London did so because they were forced. The leaders sent envoys door to door, commanding men to join or face the wrath of the mob. Old men, boys, even the sick or lame, were threatened, beaten, or killed if they refused. In the records of the time, there are chilling accounts of sons forced to fight against fathers, of neighbors who turned on each other under pressure, of entire communities torn apart not by loyalty, but by the terror of being left behind. Once pressed into service, your fate was out of your hands. You might be forced to storm a castle, march for days without food, or stand in a line of trembling men facing knights on horseback. Sometimes you were sent against your own kind. Peasants ordered to crush another town's rebellion. Town militia sent to suppress their own neighbors. There are chronicles of men hesitating at the edge of battle, only to be shoved forward by those behind. To run was death. To fight was madness. Death in these clashes was random and brutal. Few had real weapons. Even fewer had any training. Some never made it to the battlefield at all. Disease and exhaustion took many before the first blow was struck. In the chaos, you might be trampled by your own side, caught in a rain of arrows, or slaughtered by professional soldiers who saw you as little more than fodder. Some men survived by hiding among the dead, crawling away under cover of night, or surrendering and begging for mercy. Survival offered little comfort. Victors or vanquished, pressed men returned home changed, if they returned at all. Many brought back wounds that festered or never healed, trauma that lingered in nightmares, guilt for the things they had seen or done. Some faced punishment for not fighting hard enough. Others lived in fear that the next uprising, the next war, would bring another knock at the door. The machinery that made this possible was not just the tyranny of lords, but the needs of towns themselves. Defending a city was everyone's responsibility, and so everyone was vulnerable. When wars flared between rival cities or against invaders, the call went out, not just to the strong or the brave, but to all who could lift a tool. Women, too, were sometimes pressed into service, hauling water to the front lines, mending torn uniforms, or defending homes with pots, stones, or whatever they could grasp. In siege or riot, the line between civilian and soldier disappeared. For the medieval poor, this was a double trap. Many were already indebted to their lords, their lives controlled by customs and laws they could not change. When the summons came, refusal was unthinkable. The fields were left untended, families abandoned, livelihoods destroyed. And when the fighting ended, those who survived might return to homes burned, crops ruined, and new taxes levied to pay for a war they never wanted. It was not only in revolt that men were pressed into arms. Towns under attack would force all able-bodied men to the walls. There are stories from the 100 Years' War of men dragged from church services and taverns, thrust into hastily formed ranks as enemy banners appeared on the horizon. Some tried to bribe their way out to claim sickness or old age, but in times of desperation, mercy was rare. Records show that even in peacetime, the threat of being forced into service hung over every household. In many cities, lists were kept and inspected, and secret musters held to ensure no one slipped away. During the brutal Wars of the Roses, the English countryside echoed with the tramp of press-ganged men, sometimes marched off by torchlight, never to return. In all of this, the individual had no say. You did not choose your fight. You did not choose your cause. You fought because you were told or because you were afraid not to. The consequences of refusal, public shaming, the loss of your home, violence against your family, were simply too great. This was the ordinary reality for generations. To live in a world where power flowed not from the will of the people, but from whoever could gather the largest, angriest mob, where loyalty was measured in your willingness to obey, and courage was often just another word for being too frightened to run. There were moments of heroism, yes, and moments of rebellion that changed history. But for most, the experience was not glory. It was terror and loss. In the shadow of medieval city walls, the call to arms was the sound of history grinding forward on the backs of ordinary people. Every battered shield, every broken pitchfork, every name lost in the lists of the dead is a testament to those who were given no choice, whose courage was not in fighting, but in surviving the forces that swept them up and carried them, unwilling, into the storm. People died from wearing toxic clothes. Step into a world where fashion is not just a matter of taste or status, but a risk that could cost you your health, or even your life. In the medieval and early modern streets, color was power. The more vivid your clothing, the higher your standing. Nobles flaunted luminous scarlets, deep blues, dazzling yellows, and above all, an intoxicating, almost impossible green, a shade so bright and striking it seemed stolen from the heart of the forest itself. But the secret of this brilliance was a poison that would seep into the lives and bodies of all who dared to wear it. Imagine yourself in a grand marketplace, cobblestones slick with rain, the air filled with the scents of tanned leather, roasting meats, and something sharper, the bitter tang of chemicals rising from the nearby dyer's workshop. Here, in shadows thick with steam and mystery, men and women toiled over vats of liquid color, stirring with wooden paddles, their hands stained with shades that shimmered like jewels and burned like acid. For centuries, natural dyes, roots, barks, berries, insects, had been used to color cloth, but the brightest colors were rare, costly, and quick to fade. The discovery of mineral pigments, especially those containing arsenic, copper, and lead, changed everything. It was a revolution in appearance and an invisible curse. The most sought-after green, Sheely's green, and later Paris green, was made with arsenic trioxide, an ingredient as deadly as it was beautiful. Garments colored with this pigment were highly prized. Courtiers, merchants, and even aspiring peasants saved fortunes for a scarf, a ribbon, a doublet in this vibrant shade. In candlelight or under the sun, the fabric seemed to glow with an unnatural life. Yet the cost was paid in flesh. The symptoms would appear gradually. A rash at the nape of the neck, a persistent itching at the wrists or under the arms, sores that would not heal beneath the pressure of a tight bodice or the brush of a sleeve. At first they seemed the simple price of discomfort for fashion. Everyone endured a little pain to look impressive at the next festival or banquet. But the effects grew more sinister. Skin began to crack and weep. Blisters erupted along the lines where fabric met flesh. Infection set in, fevers burned through nights, and soon strange aches bloomed in joints and bones. Some lost their hair, others watched as their fingernails blackened and split. Physicians, few as they were, called these mysterious humors, or blamed bad air, the curse of the evil eye, or a punishment for vanity. No one suspected the true culprit lay in the very threads pressed closest to the heart. For those who wore such clothing every day, servants, tailors, those who altered and cleaned the clothes of the rich, the exposure was even more intense. They handled raw cloth, breathed in clouds of dust, shaken from sleeves and hems, sometimes even tasted the tang of poison when sweat and dye mingled in their mouths. Some began to show signs of something worse: vomiting, intense abdominal pain, numbness, or tingling in the hands and feet. Over months or years, kidneys failed, livers hardened, eyesight faded, and, in the worst cases, hearts simply stopped. In time, families whispered that the brilliant green was unlucky. Rumors grew of the curse of the dyers. Why did so many of them die young, their teeth gone, their fingers twisted and raw? Why did children working in the dye houses faint, their breath rattling, their skin broken out in strange lesions? Fashion was ruthless in its demands. Those who refused to wear the latest colors risked ridicule or suspicion. Laws in many cities forbade the lower classes from wearing certain shades, reserving the most brilliant dyes for those with the money or influence to afford them. But demand was insatiable. Counterfeiters and careless dyers cut corners, using ever more toxic substances to achieve the brightest effect with the least expense. In the back streets, unscrupulous merchants dyed cheap wool with arsenic, copper, or mercury, selling the garments as luxury to those who could barely afford bread. There were other deadly pigments, deep blues laced with cobalt or lead, reds made with mercury-based vermilion, yellows concocted from orpiment, another arsenic mineral. The palate of the wealthy was painted in poisons, and the beauty of the court was shadowed by disease. Yet no one could see the cause, and the suffering was scattered and silent. A rash here, a sudden death there, never enough for anyone to make the fatal connection. Some people tried to resist. A few wise tailors noticed that their apprentices sickened faster when working with the brightest greens. Washerwomen told stories of children dying after scrubbing noblemen's clothing, their hands erupting in blisters and sores, but in an age where the threat of plague, famine, and war loomed over every day. These quiet casualties were just one more hazard of living. The fashion for deadly color even spread to accessories and homewares. Wallpaper, artificial flowers, children's toys, and even confectionery were colored with the same toxic brilliance. A child might fall sick after playing with a bright green doll. A woman's lips would chap and bleed after licking her fingers to thread a luminous ribbon. The full reach of these poisons touched every class, every age, and every corner of society, and still the urge to be seen, to be admired, overpowered caution. Noble women died clutching their gowns, their last thoughts on beauty and reputation. Tailors and dyers perished in obscurity, their bodies used up by the invisible labor of luxury. Even as stories of sudden deaths and wasting illnesses multiplied, the market for color only grew. Only centuries later would the truth emerge. The price of that captivating green, that seductive shimmer, was measured not in coin, but in lives ruined and lost. Today, the dangers of arsenic and lead are common knowledge. Modern dyes are engineered for safety, and the deadly workshops of old are gone. But every so often, a forgotten dress is found in a museum, still glowing with that impossible, haunting green. Scientists handle them with gloves and masks, knowing that the danger lingers centuries later. A silent ghost in the weave of the cloth, a reminder that once to be beautiful was to risk everything. In the end, the story of toxic fashion is a story about the human desire to stand out, to belong, to possess the shimmer of the extraordinary, no matter the cost. It is a story written in rashes and fevers, in heartbreak and longing, in the fleeting thrill of being noticed, and the lingering agony of what it took to be seen. The next time you reach for something bright, remember those who walked the streets in colors as deadly as any sword, and paid with their health, their hope, and sometimes their lives. In the world where fashion was fate, the brightest thread could be the most dangerous of all. Getting lost meant getting mugged or killed in the alleys. Step into the shadowy maze of a medieval town after sunset, a labyrinth of crooked lanes, high walls, and silent corners where the lamplight never reaches. The air grows heavy and uncertain as you pass through ancient wooden gates, your footsteps echoing on cobblestones slick with mud and refuse. This is a world built for daylight, for the familiar patterns of trade, talk, and labor. But when darkness falls, every alley becomes a corridor of fear, a place where safety ends and the rules of day no longer apply. In these twisting streets, to lose your way was more than an inconvenience. It could cost you your life. Unlike today's cities, where street lamps cast a steady glow and police patrol the night, the medieval town after dusk was plunged into near-total blackness. Oil lamps and torches were expensive and rare, mostly reserved for main thoroughfares, churches, or wealthy homes. Most alleys and back streets were left in utter darkness, their outlines barely visible in the pale light of the moon or the occasional lantern swaying in a tavern window. There were no street signs, no maps, and for a stranger, especially a traveler or a merchant unfamiliar with the maze, getting lost was frighteningly easy. But the greatest danger wasn't just confusion. It was the people who claimed these night-bound alleys as their hunting ground. With poverty rampant, towns overflowing, and opportunity tightly guarded by guilds and lords, crime flourished where light and order faded. Gangs, cutpurses, and desperate men haunted the twisting back streets, waiting for the sound of hesitant steps or the flicker of a lost candle. They moved silently, knowing every escape route and hiding place, ready to ambush anyone who wandered too far from the safety of the crowd. For ordinary townsfolk, the threat was constant. Market workers, servants, even children sent on late errands learned to fear the dark, hurrying home in groups and avoiding shortcuts at night. The risk was greatest for outsiders, visitors who did not know the winding layouts, the landmarks, the hidden traps. To be a stranger in a medieval town was to be marked as vulnerable. You had no allies, no one to recognize your cries for help, and no one willing to risk their own safety for yours. There were few protections in place. Most medieval towns did not have organized night watches until much later. Some wealthier cities hired watchmen who patrolled with lanterns and staves, but their reach was limited and their loyalty often questionable. Many watchmen were themselves ex-criminals, paid poorly, and eager to turn a blind eye in exchange for a bribe or a share of stolen goods. For most towns, the night belonged to whoever was bold enough to seize it. Crime in the alleys was swift and brutal. Robbery was common. Cutpurses slashed purse strings, snatched bags, and vanished into the darkness before victims could even shout. More violent attacks were frequent. Victims beaten for their coins, left bloodied and broken where no one would find them until morning. Some never reappeared at all, disappearing into the maze, their bodies tossed into cesspits or shallow graves outside the walls. For women, the dangers were compounded by the threat of sexual violence, and for the elderly or infirm, even a small injury could be fatal in a world without hospitals or police. The fear of the alleys bled into the very architecture of medieval towns. Houses were built with barred windows and thick doors, bolts slid shut at sunset, and families huddled together for safety. Taverns and inns closed their doors to latecomers. Those with means would hire armed escorts or send servants ahead with torches to light the way. Entire neighborhoods gained reputations for lawlessness, places even the watch would not go. Some alleys earned names like Murder Lane or Thieves Alley, grim reminders of the blood spilled in the shadows. Yet even as fear grew, most towns did little to address the danger. Punishments for theft and murder were harsh, public whippings, hangings, and mutilations. But these were reactions, not prevention. There was little attempt to reform or even catch repeat offenders. Justice was sporadic and often corrupted by bribes or favoritism. The absence of organized law enforcement meant that crime became a way of life for the desperate, the outcast, and the ruthless. Over time, the memory of those who vanished in the alleys became part of the urban folklore, a warning whispered to children and travelers alike. "Don't stray from the main road after sunset," mothers would caution, "or the shadows will swallow you whole." Lost shoes, torn cloaks, and bloodstains became clues in unsolved tales, fueling the town's collective anxiety. For those who survived, the experience marked them for life. Some avoided the streets entirely, planning every journey to end by dusk. Others joined the criminal world, learning to blend with the shadows rather than fight them. Some returned home, changed, carrying bruises and stories that would never fully leave them. The medieval alley after dark was a place of primal fear, a theater of power, desperation, and silent violence. In these unlit corridors, the boundaries of law dissolved, and the only rule that mattered was survival. Getting lost meant more than losing your way. It meant stepping out of the world you knew and into a realm where no one would come if you screamed, and where morning's light often revealed only silence and the uneasy shuffle of feet that had seen too much. The threat of those alleys was so deeply felt that even as centuries passed and towns modernized, the caution endured. Today's lit streets and constant surveillance are built upon the bones of those who disappeared in the darkness, silent witnesses to a time when getting lost could mean the end of everything, and when every shadow in the alley was a warning, one you ignored only once.